I didn't intend to get really good at this, but I've just noticed that a lot of my clients tend to do the same thing. So I've gotten really, really good at getting people very strong while they're getting leaner. And just, I think the process that maybe I go through is, I'm not sure if it's unique or super different or anything like that, but it's something that I've become pretty adept in, just because a lot of my athletes are more performance based, and a lot of them also are just kind of out of shape. And
It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest again is Daniel DeBrocke. He was on episode 168, so I highly suggest you go back and watch that one. If you're interested more into his history and background, go into that. We're not going to recap and go over that all over again, but I will have you summarize it once we get started here in a very short, concise type of way. But first, what I need you guys to do is, if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe. Only something like 70% of the people who watch the podcast don't subscribe. So it's not that big of an ask to just kind of slide over and click subscribe to subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening on audio, leave us a review, like, subscribe, comment, all those other fun things. Got that out of the way. So Dan, and I have Tom, assisting here. So we'll get into some geeky, technical science training stuff
down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I have no idea what his notes are. So we'll just kind of play it from the hip and see where it goes. So Daniel, just recap real quick your background and summary.
Sure. So I guess to start off, I am subscribed, so you guys definitely should subscribe. So I've been a coach for, I think, like about 12 years now. I initially kind of started getting a little bit more traction writing for different publications like Elite, Kabuki, T-Nation, things like that. And then I started working for Kabuki, and then eventually became director of education. Then about a year and a half ago, we parted ways and started my own company. And now I'm doing coaching and education just kind of on my own.
How's it been after starting your own company?
Man, I was really scared at first, and then it completely blew up, which I totally did not expect. So it's been stressful, but incredibly, I've been super grateful for sure at how things have gone, and just like my clients and the clients who decided to just reach out to come with me. And I've been very fortunate just kind of how things sort of kicked off, I guess. There were a lot of opportunities that sort of just happened at the right time. So it's been going very well. Yeah.
What would you be both of you guys work with a whole host of different type of clients, but what would be your main demographic of client you're working with?
Definitely strength and physique. And oddly enough, I didn't intend to get really good at this, but I've just noticed that a lot of my clients tend to do the same thing. So I've gotten really, really good at getting people very strong while they're getting leaner. And just, I think the process that maybe I go through is, I'm not sure if it's unique or super different or anything like that, but it's something that I've become pretty adept in, just because a lot of my athletes are more performance based, and a lot of them also are just kind of out of shape and a little bit fat when they come to me. And so we're like, okay, if we want to perform at the best level, we need to get you lean. And then we lose like maybe 20, 30 pounds, and they're hitting all-time PRs in competition, substantially lighter. And then we get them back up, and they're like way, way stronger at that point, and they're healthier. And so they're just better performance just in general. They feel better.
Would you say most of them are competitive? I mean, as far as
I'd
competing?
say probably about 60% are competitive. And then probably about 20% are just very serious about training, but they're not looking to like compete or anything like that necessarily. And then maybe like 20 or 10% are just kind of general population, just want to get fit or strong or whatever it might be.
How would you define your overall training philosophy?
Man, that's actually been changing a lot recently. I think the biggest thing is just really driven around behavior and being extremely involved in the coaching process. And this is actually something I got, oddly enough, from like marketing from Alex Hormozi's book. He was talking about, your offer and really dialing in your offer. And so I've been spending the last several months really thinking about what my offer is and how I can differentiate myself. And I was just like really grinding my head, really trying to think about things, talking to a lot of my clients, talking to a lot of other people, booking consults with other coaches, asking them what they're doing, and really trying to find something that was very unique. And so I think that was kind of the biggest thing that I realized was one of my biggest strengths that I don't think a lot of other people do, is like the level of communication and the level of involvement that I have with a lot of my clients. So for instance, every time I write a new training block for a client, I'll record like a 20-minute video going over, here's the exercise we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's the intent for all of these exercises, here's going to be the progression strategy we're using. So this is exactly how I want you thinking about this versus this, because I've even heard you say, like, how often do you actually follow the program, what's written down?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the times you end up deviating. And so I think that for me, if I get people to just execute at a really, really high level, even if what we're doing...
Hey guys, real quick, we realized that something ridiculous, like 80% of the people that watch the podcast don't subscribe. So subscribe to the channel and make sure to check out the description for more details on the guest, links to their pages, and give us a few days, but the show notes will be there. Or not the show notes, the timestamps. Hey, we're just rolling with this thing right now. If you're serious about your training goals, you know what you put in your body matters. We also know the supplement industry is a complete mess. This is why we've partnered with First Attachment, and they are the sponsor of today's episode. Whether you want to lose fat, build muscle and strength, or just boost your overall health, First Attachment has something for you, ranging from pre and intra-workout, fat burner, kidney and liver support, and nighttime recovery, all designed with performance in mind. If you care about what goes into your supplements, and you should, you'll be glad that First Attachment prioritizes clean, effective ingredients without any unnecessary fillers or artificial additives. Plus, I have known one of the owners for over 2 decades, and Justin Harris is not one to cut corners and someone I've always trusted with advice on training, nutrition, and supplements. Head over to firstattachment.com and check out their full lineup. As a special offer for Table Talk listeners, use the code TABLETALK at checkout for a 10% discount on your first order.
Isn't necessarily 100% like the best. That execution covers so much more ground that it almost doesn't even matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so the outcome that we're able to produce, just because of how dialed in they are with their technique, with their nutrition, with coming up with strategies to pivot or whatever, maintain their progress and consistency while they're on vacation or at a wedding or whatever it might be, is I think probably one of the biggest things that I really focus on.
Is there some that could be more seen? It's still product, it's marketing. It's you see what I'm saying? It's servicing the product.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the product is the actual coaching,
Mm-hmm.
the X's and O's, the training, nutrition, and stuff like that. You kind of mentioned block. Would it all fall through block as far as how you're programming for people? And if so, is there certain blocks that are going to follow certain blocks? For instance, a competitive athlete is going to have a peaking block, where if they're not competitive, they're probably not going to have a peaking block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So if someone's not competitive, I generally don't peak them unless they want to, but we'll generally just kind of go like different accumulation cycles. We might do intensification, but we're not necessarily going to push them up to 1 RM or anything like that. But yeah, I mean.
So to tell me the difference between the accumulation and intensification for those that don't know.
Sure. So for me, I tend to structure my accumulation cycles in addition to like a restoration cycle. So I'll usually have areas where we're focusing on like primarily like myofascial adaptation. So we're looking at strengthening tendons, strengthening ligaments, building muscle, and getting a lot of like the skill acquisition type things. So if you're doing squats, I want you to get really proficient at a squat. If we're doing like rows, I want you to get really proficient at doing rows. And we're all trying to do it to, facilitate more muscle growth and kind of building that foundation, even work capacity and stuff like that. So that when you get into those higher intensity phases where we actually start to peak and shift from myofascial type adaptations into neural drive type adaptations, then it's more, specific skill work at much, much higher loads. So 85% plus, or, like doing triples, singles, doubles, or whatever at like a 2 RIR, things like that. And sometimes I might even do, and this is something I actually learned from Shane Germain, which I found to be really cool, and it works super well for certain athletes, and he was probably more advanced athletes, where like I'll do 2 weeks of accumulation, 2 weeks of like accumulation and then 2 weeks of intensification, just kind of alternating back and forth. So let's say you have like a 6 week kind of peaking block or whatever, and 6 week of like accumulation. Basically, you just take the first 2 weeks of this, and you just kind of stagger them. And the second 2 weeks, and you stagger them. And when I first heard about that, I was like, I don't know how that works, but I've tried it with a couple athletes and it actually works super, super well, especially for the guys who love just crushing it and pushing super hard. You kind of force them to take a little bit of time away from the really, really heavy stuff, but then you let them run every couple of weeks. And I've just found that even psychologically, it lets some of them, it kind of gives them their fix, so to speak, so they don't do stupid crap in the accumulation cycle when they're not supposed to be pushing like insane weights. And I've seen really good progress, which is pretty surprising.
So how would the percentages of that, I want to kind of keep this general so we're not talking over people's heads, but so basically you have 2 or lighter percentage weeks and then 2 heavier percentage weeks, right?
Yeah, essentially.
So when you come back, so you got the lighter, then say the 2 percentage weeks are 82 and 84%. And then you go into the 2 lighter weeks. When you come back into the 2 heavier weeks, do you start at the 86 or do you have to bring it back down?
No, I'll so let's say, just kind of following your example, let's say you go 80, 82, 86, 88 or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'll go 80, 82, then the accumulation ones where it's lighter, and then I'll pick right back up. So 84, 86, and then lighter, and then 88, 90 or whatever it might be.
And they've been able to adapt to that.
Exactly. So
I would have the same reservations that you would have at first. It's like, no, wait a minute, that's going from 84%, 2 weeks off, right into the 86.
Yeah. So that was exactly my thing. I was like, to me, that just seemed like a crazy jump. But Shane is a phenomenal coach. And so he said something like that. And I was like, well, you know what? I'll try it. So I chatted with one of my athletes and I was like, hey, this might be something you want to try. I think you might find it fun, because he likes to just kind of bang his head through a wall. That's the type of training he loves. And I was like, here's my reservations about it, but I think that we can make this work. Are you okay with trying it? He's like, yeah, sure. We did it. And he's been like crushing it. He hasn't really had any problems.
For how long has he been crushing it? Several months?
We went through about 10 weeks.
Okay.
Was total. And he got substantially stronger during that period.
So 4 or 5 rotations though.
Basically just 2 blocks combined together. Yeah. And so we did that and he got really, really good progress. Now, again, we've only done one cycle of that. So I can't say with 100% certainty that it's because of that approach or if it's just because of the novelty of it.
Yeah.
And so,
well, you repeated it 4 times because it's what I would see with that is if you just did it one time, it's kind of like a fake peak.
Sure. Yeah.
Because you're just deloading and then hitting it hard. But for that to repeat 4 times over 10 weeks and scale up from there, then that's interesting.
So, I mean, I think because I've had a lot of success having undulating weeks where I'll do, and that's actually what I'm doing right now for my deadlifts. So yesterday I was doing like lighter deadlifts. So I'll work up to like, not a true 12 RM, maybe like a 12 RM at like a 2 reps in reserve kind of thing. And then I'll do some back offs. And then the next week, I basically just do 3 sets of half the volume. So if I'm doing 12 reps, I'll do 3 by 6 at my top load. So it's a pretty drastic drop in volume. So I go like, quote unquote heavier week and then a lighter week. And I'm not saying it's quite the same thing, but it's a similar idea. And that's worked really well for me. And so I was kind of like, okay, well, maybe it's something like that. And there's still questions that I have about it, about why it works and about maybe some situations for when it wouldn't necessarily be as appropriate. But it's been really interesting just trying it out anyways. So
do you think in this context that's working better because your accumulation phases are genuine accumulation phases? So what I mean by that is if you look at a lot of strength athletes' accumulation phases, there's still a lot of heavier loading or intense methods in there. There's still a lot of competition lifts in there. Whereas if you're doing true accumulation phases and making them take that step back, working on, kind of like we were talking about yesterday, actually working on their structure, the tendon development, motor control, all that type of thing. Because you're doing that and making them take that step back from that neurologically draining stuff, you're just setting themselves up to always take that extra little step forward, if that makes sense, because the structure is being built as you go through those repetitive, more intense phases.
It could be. Again, this is something that I'm still somewhat new to. So I'm hesitant to say this is why I think it works. I would speculate that's probably part of it. There's probably some other things there, and I'd have to experiment with a little bit more before I felt a little bit more confident based on the kind of patterns and the consistency that I'm seeing across more athletes. But yeah, and I think one of the tricky things too is, like, let's say if you're doing like some sort of intensification cycle and you're doing low bar squat if you're a powerlifter, right? Do you go SSB in the accumulation? You know, do you go high bar? Do you go low bar? And if you are doing low bar, like, what's your volume looking like? You know, and so that was something I also had questions about, because this particular individual, we were going back and forth between high bar and low bar, and their technical base was really strong. And so it didn't seem to really affect their ability to switch back and forth. I seriously, I don't think I would not do that with someone who's newer and who doesn't have like more consistent, like really ingrained neural technique. But yeah, it's been interesting either way. So
in the world of kind of like, should we say, athletic training, the accumulation phase would kind of be defined as not necessarily where you make progress, but where you lay the foundations to handle the workload that's to come in the intensification phase, where you do make your progress. But what I'm saying is I think in the strength world, they almost get muddied together a little bit too much. So it becomes like a semi-intensification phase. Whereas if you're running what you'd say like a true accumulation phase, where you are focusing on that structural element there, you're always setting them up to be able to just rev that little bit higher, if you like, when you do touch on those intense methods.
Yeah, I see what you're saying now. Yeah. I do think that that's probably an element, because I tend to do, like I said, I tend to do a lot of restoration type work. So trying to restore just general function of like thoracic rotation, thoracic extension, just overhead flexion ability, even shoulder extension, just general things like that. So we'll have in a lot of those exercises. And so I think it takes a lot of the burden off of some of the neurological stuff. And even like you were saying, a lot of the times when people are doing an accumulation cycle, they'll still be doing sets of like 5 pretty heavy, you know, like let's say a 2 RIR for a couple sets of 5 or whatever. That's still pretty heavy for an accumulation block. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I tend to try and pull away from that stuff and actually get people to take time at lighter loads, just building up more skill and building up more of those like myofascial adaptations and giving their tendons, their joints, their ligaments a lot of time to actually recover. And so I'll do a lot of orthopedic type drills. I'll do a lot of skill acquisition and restoration type stuff. And so that we can build up volume, but in different ways, so that when they get to the intensification stuff, they don't experience the same bottlenecks. Whereas if you don't address some of those underlying issues, you might be able to do, like we've all seen guys who've, you know, they can deadlift, let's say 500 for a set of 10, no problem. But you toss on 600 and they can't even pull it off the ground. You're like, okay, what's going on? You know? So to me, when I see that, I'm like, okay, one, maybe it's a technical thing, but a lot of the times it's not. A lot of the times they just legitimately have like some sort of structural issue where they have a muscular discrepancy where something is just legitimately weak, and it can tolerate a lot of volume. But once you go past a certain intensity, their capacity to brace, their capacity to coordinate, and like a lot of the motor control stuff just completely breaks down at higher loads. So that's why I like a lot of that stuff, is because you can kind of adjust their technique and really hone things to a better degree, so that when they actually do transfer over, we've spent enough time working on some of the motor coordination type things and developing certain myofascial adaptations. And now when they go into heavier loads, you can actually test and see, hey, how effective are we at making those adjustments? And that's your proof on whether or not it's working, basically.
Let's peel this back a little bit, because people may not know what a real accumulation phase is. And this kind of hit when you were saying, you know, it's neither right nor wrong, because a lot of people will have transition. It's not really accumulation. It's like accumulation with a transitional block in there. But when we're speaking about blocks and we're speaking about these phases, I think the best way for people to understand that is to go with exactly what it is, no transitions happening in between, because they get confused. Right. So somebody will show, here's a accumulation block, but they have this, they're keeping the squat, you know, as intensification, just lighter, but it's really not how it should be, but it works or doesn't, you know what I'm saying? Doesn't work. But people see that, then they're like, no, wait a minute. I thought it was supposed to be this. You know, linear periodization is the same way. You know, I think Dave Ricks just told me for all of his career, it's like 8 weeks of 8s, 5 weeks of 5, 3 weeks of 3s, 1 week of 1s. I mean, you can't make that any more simple than what it is. And I'm sure there's overlap and stuff in there. So with an accumulation phase, you're looking at basically preparing for whatever that next phase is. So
yeah. So I'm actually like a big advocate now, and this is another thing that's kind of changed over the last little while, is going lighter than you think you need to. I've really been focusing on like a lot of the recovery side of things. So I'll start people off at like 60%, where they go in and they do a workout and they're like, I don't feel like that was a hard training session. And I'm like, that's fine. That's what we want, Like, I'm talking about the main list. So I think you should always push your accessories super freaking hard. But on the main lifts, I think that there is a time and a place to kind of sort of deload them. Deload's not the right word, but start off where you're kind of building a little bit more of a base, giving your body time to recover, and then just slowly building back up again. Whereas like I might be doing, so for instance, like this block, I started doing, for my day one bench press, I'm doing 3x8. And then the next week I'm going to do, so it's 3x8 at 60%. Next week I'm going to do, like 4x7, then 5x6. So it's very basic, and I'm adding 5% each week. And then after that, I go back to 3x8, but I increase by 5%. And then I'm just doing that. So it's pretty linear in that sense. So the first couple of weeks are not that hard, right? But if I start doing like dumbbell press or like a cable fly cluster set or something like that, that's where you really get the opportunity to just completely trash your muscles. But again, the objective is not lifting weight. The objective is actually messing up your muscles. So gaining a lot of hypertrophy, gaining more range of motion when you're doing your pec flies, not just moving weights. And so we still maintain a really high intensity of effort, but it's concentrated on a lot of the accessory movements. So your primary movements can be more skill-based, and then we can build up volume. And then by the time you reach those higher intensities, all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, this actually feels way easier than the last time I was doing this weight in the previous block. And that's a really good indication in my mind that we're making great progress. So even the other day I was telling you, like, yeah, it was a light day, but at the same time, I know what that feels like. And doing it, especially after having traveled for like 12 hours or 14 hours or whatever my flight was, I was really surprised. I was like, okay, I know that I'm getting stronger. And a lot of that is because of how I'm managing my recovery and the volume. And so I think that's a really big thing that I tend to focus on when we're doing accumulation blocks, and just kind of sort of building up the volume. And I tend to focus a lot on building up a lot of deficits, both from a skill standpoint as well as like a muscular standpoint. And then a lot of emphasis on techniques, a lot of emphasis on like controlling the execution and even just the setup of the exercise and a lot of that type of stuff. Because then when we actually get to more of the neural stuff, that's a little bit more just about like high power output.
What do you mean by building up deficits?
So like if I see someone who's squatting and every time they squat and they come back up, their hips kick back, right? To me, I'm like, okay, they're really like they have a quad weakness, right? That's a pretty common indicator. Or if you can see someone banging out 10 reps or whatever, but then you add 50 pounds and all of a sudden they can't do it. Then I'm like, okay, in this particular case, maybe that person has like insufficient eccentric loading capacity, right? So, a lot of people have seen like the whole Cal Dietz thing, the triphasic, where it's like, if we have a steeper inclination of like how fast we can eccentrically load, then we can concentrically load faster. And if we have more of a graded line of where we have to go slower, we can't concentrically explode after, right? And so you can kind of look at the different contraction types and say, okay, where are people's deficits? And so if I'm doing like, quote unquote triphasic type block, let's say, which I'm actually in right now, I'll work on my eccentric strength, and that would be a deficit that I have in my squat. And so that's going to progress to eventually pausing at 90 degrees on the way down, because that's when I tend to be the weakest. And then after I come out of that, then I can kind of start pushing more load. But because I've taken the time to address my eccentric weakness and like my isometric weakness, now that's not going to be a rate limiting factor for when I go into the neural side of things and I just start pushing heavier loads. So I can actually push, and I don't need to be worried as much about risking injury or just burning out or getting banged up during that process. And so just kind of trying to find whatever deficits, and a lot of the times it's technical deficits. But then especially if you have athletes who have been doing this for a long time, a lot of times you have muscular deficits as well, where you get a guy with like a massive back and like huge shoulders, and then his chest is like, there's nothing there. And so you can be like, okay, well, maybe we need to work on your pecs, because if you have bigger pressing muscles, you're probably going to be able to press more muscle. You'll probably be able to press more.
When you're using those eccentric, isometric methods like Cal Dietz's stuff, are you are you running them how he kind of writes it, where you have specific blocks that focus on just that single quality, or are you blending them together and focusing on, say, eccentric and isometric in a single block? Because see, how he writes it would be eccentric one block, isometric the next, concentric, which, you know, is one way of doing it. But, you know, personally, I find that ends up, with a lot of athletes, that ends up taking too long. You know, or you don't have enough time to run a significantly long enough block by the time they have to peak again or whatever it might be. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, well, I mean, especially for a higher level athlete, like if you look at his protocols, it's like, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's like 6 to 8 reps of like 8 to 10 seconds each. You know what I mean? Could you imagine like some of the guys who are lifting here trying to do that? They would do 2 sets and that would be it. They'd be done for like the week. So I think his protocol, you kind of have to understand that his protocol is designed for field sport athletes mostly, right? And so he has a completely different demographic than strength athletes or, you know, bodybuilders or whatever. But I guess we'll kind of stay towards strength athletes. And so I don't do it like he does, but I kind of take the same basic premise and I'll usually run like, you know, maybe 3 to 4 weeks or something like that of the eccentric. And then I'll go into isometric and that'll usually be about like 3 weeks. So maybe let's say 6 weeks total ish, give or take. And I find that that's a good amount of time because if you go too much longer than that, I find you're probably going to get pretty beat up from it. Yeah. And I don't know that you'd get a whole lot more out of it. Now, in terms of like the rep scheme and things like that, I personally, what I'm doing right now, and again, there's a million different ways to do it, but what I'm doing right now is like a single with 10-second eccentric. And then I do 3 sets back off of 5 reps with a 5-second eccentric. And I'll maybe drop the loading by like 20% or 15% or something like that, you know? And then as I progress, I'm going to go from like 10 and 5-second eccentrics to, you know, 7 and 4, 5 and 3. And then after that, I'll drop to a 3-second pause, which is the isometric phase. And I'll do that. For me, my weak point is as I'm going down, I'll stop at 90-degree, you know, knee flexion angle. And then I'll drop the rest of the way and come back up. And in that one, I think it's important to be able to absorb it quickly. So you don't necessarily want to go down slowly, hit that pause and go back down. The eccentric, you definitely want to be very slow, but when you're doing the isometric, I think what people mess up is you want to be able to absorb it really fast. So you want to be able to go down fast and just stop instantly and have no movement. And then, you know, I'll do like a 3-second pause and then you go back down and come back up. And that really, really helps kind of build your tolerance for that type of loading. And so when you have the tolerance for the loading, then you can actually build up just more base and you can build up more neural drive after the fact. And so that's what I've been doing. And I find it's pretty effective. But again, there's a million ways to skin a cat.
You mentioned obviously like accumulation is a good time to look for deficits and that type of thing. So when you're looking at methods like that, like the eccentrics, like the pauses at the midpoint and things like that, do you have kind of ranges that you look for to expect people to be able to handle? Like, for example, you said the single with a 10-second eccentric. Like, is there a ballpark figure you would expect a powerlifter, strength athlete, or whatever to be able to perform of their regular 1 rep max that would say to you, this is not an issue, or perhaps this is an issue? And I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I maybe other people do. I don't necessarily have those figures. For me, it's more just like an experience thing. You can kind of look at someone and be like, this is kind of, it's sort of the coaching intuition. That's I wish I had a better answer. No. But I'll look at someone and you can just kind of tell like when they come out of the hole, they're just not very strong. You know what I mean? Like they're kind of like wobbling, and it's not that the weight is that hard because they can do a couple of reps, but they just don't look strong eccentrically. And so for me, that's usually what I'll look at and be like, okay, we probably need to do this or probably need to mix in some of this. And that's usually what it is. It's just kind of the coaching eye sort of thing.
So like looking shaky on the way down, maybe the bar path kind of like moving back and forth.
Yeah,
it's like that.
It's that, but then it's also just like, especially if they're doing reps. So if you're doing like 5 reps, but on rep number 1, I'm like, on the way down, I'm like, ooh, this is looking real shaky. And then you go up and it's fast. And I'm like, okay. And then every rep looks like you're going to fail. I'm like, okay, we probably need to do some eccentric loading. We probably need to, especially if you're getting down and then like, let's say about here, you start really shaking. That's usually if someone's really shaky in their squat or in their bench or whatever it might be, that's usually where I'll put in the isometric.
Sure.
A lot of the times people, when they're doing pause squats, they might pause at the bottom because, it's like, oh, I'm weak out of the hole or whatever. I tend to do it wherever that individual's shaking most, because I think that's a pretty good indication of where there's the least amount of stability there, hence the shaking. And I've found pretty good success with that.
Sure.
So
have you found that with eccentrics and the isometrics, the concentric, that's a different weird topic for me, because I don't understand how outside of like a deadlift or even a pin press, you still got to lower it unless you just drop it.
Sure.
So we'll just leave that one off the table, because that one's always kind of confused me a little bit. To me, it's just the beginning of the next strength block. Have you found that the adaptations are fast? Right. So if you're working somebody on their eccentric or even the isometric, 1 or 2 weeks, that's a hard question to answer. Like, where should that be?
Sure.
And say if it's 50% or whatever it's going to be, because within 2 weeks, it can go radically fast because it's either detrained, or I don't want to say it's detrained. It's neurally, they're not focusing on that at all. So the first week is like, this is weird. Then the second week, boom. Then the third week, bam. Then it just caps. Then it's really hard. Yeah. Have you found that to be the case with both of those?
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the reasons why, like, I'll keep those blocks about 3 to 4 weeks long, because I find it's really fatiguing for people if you do them too long, especially for stronger lifters. But then also, like you said, the skill side of things, like you get so good so quickly at it that there's not a whole lot you can squeeze out of it for too long. So
that's where I always would get confused about if I would run that, because the skill acquisition is going to be the first 2, maybe 3 weeks, right? Then there's not much else to milk after that. Then I'm like, did this really actually do anything, or did they just become more efficient at it? Because the real gains come after the skill acquisition has been acquired, right? You see where I have my little stumbling block with that but then it becomes harder to progress unless you started lighter, I suppose, or bigger tempos, or created some kind of runway.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting point of discussion, because this is something I've thought about quite a lot as well. So there's a couple ways that I'll think about this. So, you mentioned starting lighter. My problem personally with starting lighter is if you start lighter and you're doing eccentrics, I don't think you're getting enough out of it. I just think it's too far away from what you're trying to accomplish. You're just not really going to get that much out of it. At least is my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong, and then if you go too heavy, you're just going to completely wipe yourself out. And so there kind of seems to be that sweet spot where if you do it, you're definitely getting skill. You're definitely getting more awareness around like your positioning. And so I definitely think that's part of the adaptive process. But I also do find that there are structural adaptations, just in the sense that when I'm looking at people lifting, they don't have the same instability. And I don't know if that could be necessarily corrected just through skill alone. That's what I suspect. I don't know if that's like, I can't validate that, but that's kind of what I would suspect. So I think it's a bit of both. It's hard to say how much of each, but that's something I've noticed in some of my athletes, and that's something that I'm definitely noticing in myself when I do this. And you just feel stronger, you feel more stable, and you don't have that same, I don't know. It's almost like if you do like heavy unracks. You unrack like, let's say 10, 15, 20% more than your max, whatever, and you hold it for a minute and you put it back. It's almost like the sort of super compensation effect. I know it's not super compensation, but that's almost how it feels, where after you unrack, when you squat down normally, you're just like, oh, that feels like nothing. So whether that's a skill thing, whether that's like some sort of myofascial adaptation, whether it's a combination, I would suspect it's probably both. I don't know how much of each it is, but it's, like the question is something that's really like tormented me as well.
Well, I think for anybody that's like geeking out on program, this is the one question that people who really are like into it and geek over it are infatuated with. And it's the question that all those that, I don't want to say aren't good, but all those that just are just programming for programming's sake never think about. Right. Because they see the progress, but they don't understand that a lot of that progress is just skill acquisition because the person's never done that movement before. But then you change it before you actually start to get any real adaptations or strength out of it. And they don't know that if they were, fuck it. If they were better at what they did, they would be able to run it for a few more weeks because they would know how to actually program instead of just switching shit for the sake of switching shit.
Yeah.
And that happens more times than not. And I get it, because if somebody's working with 40 clients or 50 clients, you know, it's hard to manage, you know, and it's easy to keep things in 4 or 6 week, 2 week, whatever blocks it's in, just because you don't, your primary exercise could be on a linear 10-week run. Secondary could be changing every 2 or 3 weeks. And this is coaching, right? So, but that's a lot harder to implement with a large number of people. Then everything's just going to change in 4 weeks.
Yeah. So I'd be really interested, actually. I'm going to be very selfish here. I'd be interested to know how you would do something like that, or if you even do anything like that.
What, the eccentrics and pausing and stuff like that?
Yeah, like how you would structure something like that. Because you're talking about the timeline, right?
I would base it as a secondary movement on a weak point, right? So it's I try to have everything in 3-week waves.
Yeah.
Right. Caveats, right?
Yeah.
Unless, you know, it's a beginner and it's going to run more linear, because more linear old school periodization for somebody that's just getting started most of the time is going to outperform anything that's out there. Right. Nobody wants to admit that because it's not pretty. It's not sexy. It's just basic shit, but it is how it is. And if something pops up, like they don't have the intent on the bottom of a box squat, right? So first I'm going to try to address it by just addressing it. Like, stand up faster. Like, can this be addressed with the easiest thing? But it can be what you're talking about. It can be their eccentric strength. They're just getting fucking tanked because they suck eccentrically. So they have nothing really to come back with out of that, or they're just weak out of that bottom position, which could be that. So after the primary movement, I would stick in, you know, slower tempo. Is probably where I would go first before I would go with pauses. Because pauses, especially on a squat, are mentally hard for somebody to manage, right? Because especially if it's sub-maximal, I mean, you're getting down in there and you're like, oh, fuck. You know, then you're not really getting the intent that you want because their stress is so high. Their mental stress is so high that now that's becoming more added shit to recover from. But I would run it based on the week, man. So it's maybe 1 or 2 times. So if I see it on a Saturday squat session, they'll do something on that day, then something midweek, and then we'll see how next Saturday looks. A lot of the times this is just neural, you know, and it's not even really a weak point. It's just, lack of a better word, neural retardation. I don't know what to call it, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, they remember, boom, it's back. Okay, this really wasn't a weak, I guess it was. I wouldn't call it a weak point.
Right.
Now, if it's still there, then it's like, okay, we got to think this out a little bit. Like, this is now going to become some 3 or 4 week thing that's going to have to progress and so forth. But I try to test it first. You know, because it can be a bad day. It can be a lot of different things.
Right.
You know, a lot of the times it's just, and the people out here are intermediate to advanced. So a lot of the times it's just them not knowing how to keep a contraction in a certain area.
Right.
You know, they're for some reason their upper back doesn't want to keep their shoulders down and tight when they're benching. Well, why is that? You know, is their upper back weak? They pull 700 pounds. They bench like 400. It's probably not their upper back being strong enough to be able to stabilize this. They either don't know what they're doing, you know, or it just needs, for lack of a better word, like reactivated and then kind of put in. But to your point, if it has to run out, then it's probably, in my brain, I'm looking at 3 weeks minimum, and then some kind of accumulation week. You know, just some week just to get used to this is what you're doing. And it will be under what you're talking about. It will be too light. But most people don't do slow eccentrics. Most people don't do any type of pausing. They don't do any of that. So the first week is kind of like teasing them to where they think, man, that wasn't that bad. And you're like, yeah, okay. You know, it was also just, it was 50%. And actually this shit's going to 70%. It's going to be a different story. And then go from there, then hope after that block that issue has been resolved. But I'll also look for what accessories can also address that same issue that aren't going to increase the fatigue ratio too much. You know, so if it's weak out of the bottom, it can be quads too, right? So we can throw in some light leg extensions at the end if they can't recover from 3 sets of 20 on a leg extension, then we have greater underlying problems that probably need to filter out of the block and go more into just a full accumulation block, which I would define that kind of more along the lines of how Bumpa would with anatomical adaptation. You know, it's not easy, right? But it's working from the fingers and toes in instead of from the core out, which is kind of what the strength blocks would do. And nobody likes to do it. Nobody, you know, so you sneak that shit in after a meet. You know, it's like, just do all this crap. And it's from the strength athlete standpoint, it's kind of sad that they don't like to do that, because that's building the base for the next time, but they take it about half as serious as what they would do a peaking phase.
Yeah. I mean, I think with the eccentric stuff specifically, for me, the time frame would depend what you want out of it, right? Like if we're talking skill acquisition, neurological adaptation, that's like a software issue, right? That can happen really fast. So if you're doing like an intense eccentric method, like weight releasers, negative only reps, supermax, whatever, 2 or 3 weeks of that, you're cooked, and you have probably milked 99% of what you're going to get out of it. If we're looking at tendon, microtendon development, there's even some studies showing that you get more hypertrophy at the distal end of your muscle towards the tendon insertion and things like that from eccentric only work. Then obviously, if you're looking for a structural adaptation from it, what are you actually going to get in 2 or 3 weeks? You know, it's not going to be a lot, right? So then maybe it needs to be run in the background for several blocks, but then it could be done on accessories and smaller movements rather than those prime movers. And, you know, sometimes methods like that, you know, you mentioned you've got a guy who just likes to go hard all the time in the gym, right? And, you know, that applies to a lot of people. Sometimes those methods can be a really good way of letting them push hard on some compound lifts without actually trashing themselves. You know, they can go to RPE 9 on their SSB squat, say for 6 reps, but it's done with an 8-second eccentric. So what's the load actually going to be then? You know, which sure, it's still RPE 9, but RPE 9 at 300 pounds as opposed to 500 pounds is a different animal, right? For their nervous system, at least. So, you know, if you're someone who wants to kind of map out their roadmap to a meet, and they kind of don't want them lifting above X amount as we go through the blocks, and we want the average load to increase, then those type of methods just give you a way of incrementally working that up as you go through, while still giving them the satisfaction of I pushed a squat or deadlift or whatever hard, right? And still making them feel like they're doing something, because like you said, a lot of the time, if it's not intense enough, they'll just put nothing into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting hearing like other people's perspectives on this, because like I said, there's a million ways to skin a cat. I kind of like what you were talking about, though. I feel like that would permit you to do it for much, much longer. And yeah, I mean, I guess if you're talking about some of the physiological adaptations that would actually occur, I could definitely see an argument for requiring longer blocks. I guess for me, part of what I wonder though is like, how does that change when you're doing it on, like, let's say you're doing it just on the primary lift versus if you're doing it more as like a block where you have concentrated periods where you're doing, let's say, you know, you got your squat eccentric, but then you're doing like some sort of eccentric Nordic curl or other things like that. And like, would the density affect the physical adaptations as opposed to just being, you know, skill acquisition from like a motor control standpoint? And so I don't know. Again, these are still things that I like think about, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying though. Like, yeah,
but you know, every method's got pluses and minuses, right? Like we can say for the eccentric stuff, if we're looking at hypertrophy, you could argue that it's probably going to be better for hypertrophy. It'll use less load. There'll be more time and detention. They'll probably get better contractions, etc. But there's going to be more muscle damage because most of the muscle damage occurs in the eccentric. So then they can handle less volume. So there's always going to be a trade-off, right? So that's why, in my opinion, like I really like Cal Dietz's stuff, but personally, I don't like to do a whole block where it's just eccentric, just isometric, because I think those whatever the negative side effect of the method is you're using, if you put it on everything, it accumulates too much.
Oh, I definitely wouldn't do it on everything.
And then
definitely
I think you
not.
also,
I just mean the main.
Yeah,
the
I
main
mean
thing,
that's
and
kind of
then
the
maybe
big
an
caveat
accessory.
here is nothing really happens in isolation.
Yeah.
sure.
Right. So even if you are just trying to, if it's a full only eccentric block, you're telling me there's no concentric contractions happening.
Yeah.
There are, you know, and even if it's a field athlete, it's happening in their sport skill practice.
Yeah.
You know, so it's still there. So there's the art of how to blend all this, which brings us into another topic, because now you have the recovery from the training session, where it's fun, you know, the longer that you're around, to be able to see how these things just kind of like come in phases. Like recovery it's starting to, I think it kind of like peaked, and now it's starting to go back out to where people are now saying, you know, you have to actually have a training stimulus to recover from, right? Because it did become such this big thing that they're scared, like, oh shit, I just need to do one exercise, train it kind of hard, but then I need to make sure I'm sleeping 12 hours a day, getting all the fluid, getting all this. And it's like, you're not doing enough. You know, you can fucking sleep 4 hours if you're doing one thing once a week. You know, it's not that big of a deal, but it's the balance that kind of comes through there. You got to have the training be hard enough, and that will start to become more popular. It already is, to where people are saying, oh, wait a minute. Like, are we kind of overdoing this recovery shit and not talking enough about the fact that you need to train actually hard to create a stimulus to recover from?
Yeah, well, I should have given that as a caveat, actually. So yeah, like if you're doing an eccentric block, the whole block is not eccentric. It's kind of like when you're saying training to failure. Like you're not taking every set of every exercise of the entire block to failure. It's like you're doing it in kind of selected periods. So that was my bad for not saying that. Yeah,
well, there still should be some distinction between, you know, accumulation block and an intensification block, or you know, a hypertrophy block or a strength block, or whatever people want to be able to call that. And if somebody was to look at that block that knows what they're doing, they would know this is that. And if they don't, then even in conjugate, it's like, what are you doing? Right? Because it can't stay the same block all the time. You know, something has to be physically changing throughout that whole thing. And in the strength world, I do think that the accumulation block is very underrated, right? Because they're afraid they're going to get weak or whatever.
Do you think that's because people are just too scared to take an actual step?
I think it's
not
that,
a step back, but you know what I mean when I say a step back. Like, step away from the heavier stuff. Trust that you're not just going to become incompetent at the main lifts, and actually work on the groundwork stuff that you probably neglected for a long time, right?
I think it's that, and I think it could also be, you know, I may be giving more credit than what it's due, that a lot of top lifters, they're not posting those blocks.
No.
So all they ever see are the intensification or peaking blocks. And so upcoming lifters are like, this is all I need to do is to squat heavy singles and triples. That's it, you know, no accessories, and then just get out. And because that's what they see. I think I had Dave Ricks out here last week, and we were talking about when lifters follow other lifters online, it's good, right? Because it's aspirational, right?
Sure.
But at the same time, if they walk it out, you normally don't see their walkout because they're clipping it to be just that one rep. So you're not seeing that there's 3 very deliberate steps. You're not seeing how they approach the bar. So there's a lot of things online that top lifters just don't post, and I get it. Nobody wants to see them like walk up or how they do their warm-ups or how many warm-ups they do and all these other type of things. So it could be misleading to the ignorant, choosing my words wisely here, because I don't want to say uneducated. They just don't know. And then that's what they see. I'm like, well, so-and-so does this, so I have to do that. And it would be nice if when they do go through these phases where they're not as strong, you know, they actually post some of this shit. And then why they're doing it. And coaches like yourself, but both of you guys, I mean, you're posting the stuff and that has impact because people can read it, they can understand that. But the athletes who really need to read it probably aren't reading it because they're following who they want to aspire to be like and just looking at the sets and the reps they post, if they even do that.
Yeah, I think there's also an experiential gap too, because it's like, how many times have you heard people talk about, you know, they come back from an injury, and after they come back from the injury, they're like, oh man, this is something I'm really prioritizing now. And now I'm focusing on this with all my clients. And it's like, it's that injury is what catalyzed that decision to actually emphasize that as, you know, like their prehabilitation or, you know, injury prevention strategy, whatever it might be. And I think that once you actually start utilizing, you know, I don't want to say lighter blocks, but relatively speaking, lighter blocks, you know, and you go through it and you're like, man, yes, I am, you know, I have easier workouts. And again, easy is a relative term, but I have easier workouts. But then every time by the end of the block, I'm getting stronger and I'm not as beat up. My recovery's better. I'm not dreading my workouts anymore. And it's like, there's like kind of this natural phase where, you know, you can't just always be going hard all the time. And I know everyone talks about like, oh, you can't lift heavy all the time, but it's kind of the same thing about when people talk about individualization for a program. Like, I don't know any coach who says that they don't do individualized training, you know, but at the same time, like 99% of people aren't individualizing anything. So I think there's a lot of lip service paid to that, but then I think there's a bit of an experiential deficit as well, where when you've gone through that, you know, period where you're like, oh, okay, I'm doing this. It feels lighter. I want to go heavier, but I'm just going to stick to the plan, see what happens. And then you do it and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I am way bigger. I feel way better. My joints aren't banged up. And now when I'm going into my, you know, intensification cycle where I'm starting to lift heavier, like it feels better. Like when I unrack the weight, I know what it felt like last time. Now it feels better when I'm moving it. It's just everything seems to be kind of progressing. And sometimes it's a bit counterintuitive to people, especially like dummies like myself who just like to go in and smash their head into the wall every day. You know, I think it's just kind of a thing that you have to learn over and over and over again. Because even right now, I find myself wanting to push heavier, but I'm just having to literally have a conversation with myself every day and just be like, no, I shouldn't do it. I shouldn't do it. You know, yesterday I'm deadlifting and I'm doing light block pulls with like 500 pounds or whatever. And I can't remember her name, but that girl is like benching 500. You know what I mean? And so I'm just sitting here like, man, what a bitch I am, you know? And, but then I was like, okay, this is feeling super easy. I'll just toss on a little bit more weight. And I'm like, nope, stick to the plan. And I did. And I was really proud that I did that, which I know sounds really stupid. But the thing is, that's always been my issue in the past, is trying to push too hard for exactly the reason you said. It's like, oh, I'm not working hard enough. And I think I get caught up in this, and I think a lot of people get caught up in this, and maybe it's an experience deficit, I don't know, but where you gauge a workout by how it felt.
You know,
Right.
I think the answer to that is you have to have a tastier goal in mind. You know, a bigger thing that's happening 10 weeks later, to where in your head you're like, man, I really want to do this, and maybe I could, but next week is supposed to be 540, you know, or whatever you're going to jump to. And if I overextend here, then that 540s might be a grind. And then it's not worth that, because what I really want is like the 700, which is further down the road.
Right.
And that, for most lifters that have that mentality, the worst thing you want to do is to get to that day where you want the biggest thing, and then to think in your head, damn it, you know, it's either I didn't do this, or I shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. You know, so the more attractive that shiny object is, the better the compliance could be, which becomes an issue when you're no longer competing. You know, and you have to find whatever that shiny object's going to be, and really care about it. And that's with that certain mindset. You know, because what happens is a clusterfuck if there's nothing that they really care about that's there. Because like, fuck it, you know, I at least get to train one more time. So if I die tomorrow, I got the good one in. You know, and that becomes a very dangerous mindset.
Yeah. Well, Tom and I were talking about this the other day about just longevity in sport, and how, you know, a lot of the times people will say, oh, health and performance are not the same thing. And it's like, I get the statement, you know, like I get where they're coming from, because you can blast a bunch of trend and have a crazy performance. And so it's like, that's not going to be very healthy for you. But at the same time, if you extend that timeline out 5-10 years, it's like health and performance have to be aligned, and there has to be some sort of synergy there, or else you're just going to get completely beat up, or you're going to have some major health issues. You're going to have injuries. You're going to have things like that. So it's like, you know, a lot of the times you have to have that long-term focus in mind, where it's like, hey, I'd like to hit that 700 squat at my next comp, but what I'd really like is to hit an 800-pound squat maybe in 5 or 7 years down the road, or whatever it might be, right? And I think that if you just, like you were saying, where you keep that goal in mind and you just look at the little wins and you say, okay, if I do this today, that's going to get me closer to this. Like squatting a big number today is not going to get me closer to that necessarily. It's like following the plan, following the appropriate plan is going to get you closer. And you might not always feel like it, and it's just really boring and really stupid, but it's the boring, stupid shit that just is really effective and that works over time. And it's, it takes a lot of discipline, but I think sometimes people don't necessarily prioritize the longevity side of things and their health. Like you look at Dan Green, like he's like in his mid 40s and he's still pulling like 8 something, like or 9 almost. It's like, that's absurd, you know? And it's like, he's hit a lot of injuries, but at the same time, very clearly he takes his injuries seriously and he trains like intelligently, or else he wouldn't have been able to do that. And how many people, especially now with Instagram, you see so many people who like come in, they're a flash in the pan, they're insanely strong, and you're like, oh dude, everyone's screwed now that this guy is here. And then after a year they're just gone because of whatever injuries, and you're like, oh, that's really unfortunate, you know? But
everybody's going to have a certain genetic peak limit. I mean, that's not saying that that's their cap. I mean, you can always go above, you know, whatever that is. And you can get there fast, you can get there slow, you can get there in medium time. It's just depending upon how far you want to be able to push things. But it would suck to hit that point, because everything changes when you hit that point. Training, everything changes, because now the micro shit becomes really important. Because then everything matters. So when you're on that uphill, younger, blasting shit or whatever, everything's fast. But it would suck to get there and only have 2 years left because you're that beat up. You know, because you expedited something that should have taken 5, 6 years and pushed it into 2. And then you get there, then all of a sudden 2 years, you're done. You know, where if it took the 5 years, then you're running that advanced phase, I suppose, for fuck a decade. I mean, Dave Rick's just 64 or whatever he was. He's still competing. His first meet was in 82. He's 64 years old. That's you know, like unbelievable, you know, but there's long off seasons, you know, there's thought that kind of goes into it. Now, of course, when he was younger, like everybody else, to do stupid shit, but you're supposed to learn from that while you're younger, because you can get away with it when you're younger. And the problem is when they don't, you know, change the things or blast too much. But back to your point though, health still matters, because if your health is for shit, you can't recover. So if you take a boatload of training and your blood pressure's through the roof, maybe you might have to do a bro split of training one body part per day, because that's all your body can actually recover from, because it's still got to recover from all the medication and shit that you're dumping in there. So it matters. And that's why those phases are good, where we had that giant recovery. 10 years of recovery is more important than the training type of thing, because then people start to take their eye and think, well, maybe my health does matter. Maybe I don't need to be purple, you know, maybe I don't need to be, you know, 40 pounds over what my competitive weight should be, you know, healthier, recover better. And that's a good thing. You know, it can also lead into stupid shit, you know, like people rucking 5 miles every single day during a peak phase, you know.
Do you think though that there's like a misconception, maybe let's just take powerlifting as a specific example, that any intense productive training cycle creates damage? In this term, damage, we're going to talk maybe cumulative inflammation, loss of function in some degree, whether it's overhead mobility, whatever that might be. And I just think that bit gets lost, right? So if you said to someone, you know, someone just trained for a marathon, and at the end of the marathon, you can imagine the state of their hips, their knees, their ankle. Like most people can get their head around that, why they would really need to tailor it back, and maybe why you wouldn't go running on concrete for a month or something. But I think within powerlifting and strength sports, we don't take that same approach and realize that nothing comes without cost. So the best training cycle that you've ever had also may have come with the greatest recovery cost and the greatest damage. And that, although you had a good day at the meet, that doesn't mean that all of that isn't lying under the surface still. You know, you carry that through, and that needs to be dissipated before, as you would say, you're ready to start again, like another prep or whatever. And I just think people are always assuming that just if they can squat, bench, and deadlift, they're okay.
Yeah.
But they might be slowly losing motor control, motor function, whether that's like, like you mentioned, like thoracic mobility and all that type of thing. All of that stuff can be slowly caving in. And then eventually it shows on the competition lifts.
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, fuck.
That's also, most of the time, it's usually happening with increase in muscle mass and weight gain and all those other things. So those things alone, if it was just hypertrophy training and that was it, which could be lower damage, accumulated damage, they're still losing the mobility and all that. So they're losing it for a couple different reasons too. But they get in that mindset of, I'll take a couple weeks off after the meet, but if I don't start, I'm going to get weak. I'm like, of course you're going to get weak, but you're going to get stronger at other things. And then to your point, then when you start training again, going into a prep block or whatever it is, yeah, the weights are probably going to feel heavy when you start loading them back on again, but not for long. But what's not going to, you have two choices. The weights can feel heavy, and then you're going to you're going to accumulate to it, and it's going to be a better prep, or the weights can feel heavy and your elbows still hurt, your shoulders still hurt, and your knees still hurt. So which is better, right? And maybe the weight doesn't feel as heavy. So let's just say that the weight doesn't feel as heavy, but it still feels heavier, but all your shit hurts. I'd rather go in with everything not hurting and, a sub-maximum weight feeling heavier than it should than that feeling easy, but limping away. And that's kind of that pattern that they get caught up in, which is interesting to me. It really is, because the other thing that we see happen a lot is people will just default into the singles and triple training blocks. And my theory on that is they stumble across that because they accidentally or intentionally went through a peaking block. For some reason, if it wasn't before a meet, that they had a vacation, they had a lot of work. So all they could do was go in and do the heavy stuff. They couldn't do anything. They just reduced the volume, increased the intensity. And they're like, holy shit, I'm way stronger. I don't have to do all that other crap. And I really think this is how that happens. And then that deteriorates, over a period of time too, because all the supportive tissues become weaker, the contractile.
Well, you got to have something to peak from.
Yeah.
You can't peak from a peak, right? I think it's just, maybe powerlifting doesn't have a huge amount of demands in terms of skills and mobility or whatever, but there is only so much general function you can lose before your ceiling just will get capped. Like if you're an 800-pound squatter who can't do a split squat with your body weight, you might not think that's a big deal until you have to walk out a squat or something. Do you know what I mean? Like,
no, I totally know.
At some point, all of that, and some people might get to 800 pounds before they have to actually address that. Some people will get to 300 pounds, but at some point, there is only so specialized you can be before you have to go back and address all the stuff, the hundreds of things you suck at that allow you to get better at the two or three things you want to be really good at.
One of the biggest mistakes I made over my whole career was that, so if it was an injury or surgery or whatever it was, the first rule is you need to regain full range of motion. I don't disagree with that, but the way I defined it was differently than the surgeon or anybody advising me. Like, that's, to me, I need to be able to bench, so my hand's here, and if I expand my ribs and arch, it's a little bit higher, and squat to legal depth. That's my full range of motion. Once I'm there, fuck it, I'm good. Right back into it. Looking back, that's not right. I should have maintained that tissue strength beyond with those lifts. Because the way I benched it was not a very long stride. It was like 5 inches. And so now if I could do a Larson press, open my back, flare my lats, it's 14. So there's a big difference in the range of motion with the shoulders, and obviously a ass to grass squat compared to a parallel squat, completely different. But that's how I saw it. And I'm sure that's how a lot of other lifters saw it, where going back, it wouldn't have been that hard, to restore those abilities over 5 weeks after a meet. And it wouldn't be that hard to maintain them either,
Couple of goblet squats.
Start
your workout.
So I think that, I don't think it's as bad today as it was when I was doing all this stuff, but I do think it's still bad, really bad.
It is. A lot of the times too, I think the most common thing that people will see, especially coaches will know this, is someone's in pain, you start some sort of rehab program, they get out of pain and they're like, oh, awesome. And they just continue training. They stop doing all this shit. And it's like, dude.
Well, the truth of that too, though, is they never really got out of pain, right? They got to manageable pain.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, is a lot of the times people don't understand there's a variety of different stages, but generally, like when you're looking at physical therapy and rehabilitation, there's return to training, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
People get to that. But then there's return to performance. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, your tissues are fine and now you can train again and not be in pain or have manageable pain. But what's going to happen when you reach that peak? Is your body going to hold up, or is it just completely going to break down again? And because, they get out of pain, or it's like so low that it's just not a non-issue, they just kind of put it on the back burner. And it's like, okay, coming back to your point again about, am I going to get weaker, or, oh, wow, this is working, I'm getting so strong, when you're doing your peaking cycle. And it's like, okay, but dude, that's a strength expression, that's a neurological function. And so you're not losing your strength. Like if you go from peaking and then, let's say 2 weeks later, you're doing, let's say sets of 10 and 12, and it feels heavy or whatever it is. It's like, it doesn't feel heavy because you're weaker. It feels heavy because you're used to doing singles. Mm-hmm. Like your nervous system was peaked and now you're doing like more myofascial type stuff. So it's like, of course it's going to feel different. The technique is going to feel different. You're bracing, you're breathing. Like you're not going to be going like for 12 reps, like for 12 singles. It's like, you're just not going to do it. You might hold your breath and do like 4 or 5 reps and then re-air. Mm-hmm. But it's just not the same, And so you're trying to develop skills, you're trying to develop all these things, but you're just, I think being able to let go of that. And again, that's why I said it's kind of an experience thing, is because when you do it enough times, you just know that when you get back into it, you're like, oh yeah, this is how I feel, but how I feel is fucking stupid because, I know that that's not true. And this is just an emotional response. I need to just chill, let it go, trust the process, go through it. And then when you get back there, it's like, oh yeah, exactly what I, suspected. I'm way stronger now. And I'm hitting, like 20 pounds away from my old 1RM, but I'm doing them for like multiple sets of triples. Okay, that's pretty solid. And I don't feel that beat up. It feels pretty easy. So it's like, okay, that's a very clear indication that you're getting stronger. And so
one of the tipping points I found with that, which is kind of funny, is and I'm sure you have seen and know people that have been the same way, that something gets hurt, their shoulder gets hurt, or maybe they tear a bicep or something. Then they have to take time off. Then usually what comes after that statement is, man, I tore my bicep, so it's going to take 6 weeks. So I may as well, during this time, take care of my lower back being jacked up, my knee being jacked. As soon as they start saying that, so it goes from just, I'm going to find ways to train through this bicep issue, which that's the default, that's the meathead default thing, like whatever, safety squat bar, I'm not changing shit. Everything, they're going to do everything the same way. They're just going to train through it. To, this is screwed up, so I'm going to now address all the other things. Shortly after that, that starts to become implemented across the board through the whole annual plan, either into blocks for that, or, mini blocks for that, or prehab work, which is probably not as effective because it's more maintenance of that, which we'll go back into this phase that we're talking about, because once you get through that phase, you can restore all those abilities. But once you start going into other phases, those abilities will dissipate unless you have something. This is where it gets confusing with people with the blocks, right? Unless you have something residual that's kind of in there just to maintain that ability, where I think what some of the people are trying to do with the strength aspect is to keep something residual in there to keep the absolute strength ability through those other blocks, where personally I don't think that's necessary, but I get why they would think that. Now, for what we're talking about, I do think it's necessary. And for hypertrophy, I think it's necessary as well, because you can run these athletes through a 6-week hypertrophy block, which happens twice a year. So 12 weeks of the year, they're actually training to build muscle. How much muscle are they really going to build up for, national level bodybuilders hoping to put on 6 pounds of lean body mass a year with PEDs, training that ability all the time. Like you ain't going to put shit on in the 6 weeks. You're going to become, your conditioning will be better. Your muscular endurance might be a little bit better, but you're not going to put a whole lot of muscle on. Like,
if you're lucky, you probably regain what you lost in the season.
Yes. But if you have if it's integrated in some way, then I don't think you're going to build as much, but you're not going to lose
For sure.
Which that used to be, actually it was, that was one of the big kicks against just straight linear periodization that I ran into all the time before I got to West Side. Is I would build up, and start the training heavier and bigger than I ever was, because the whole off-season time was bodybuilding type stuff. Then as soon as I started dropping to 5s, which over time became sooner and sooner and sooner, because 8s suck, but they're also kind of what you do anyhow. 6 weeks later, now I'm down 10 pounds. So I'm losing, because that's all I'm doing. It's just that main thing, maybe ab work and shit like that, but nothing to really maintain that ability. I think one of my first articles on T Nation was ragging against, linear periodization because of this, but obviously what I did not put in there is how you could actually maintain those abilities throughout that whole thing. But that wasn't the point of the article. The point of the article was to kind of show, the downsides of all that and the upsides of conjugate, because that's what we have to do as writers is, balance this weird line instead of showing all the new, because everything works. Everything can work, right? If the nuance is taken into account. But as authors, we run into that weird balance.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Like, you have to put your flag in the sand at some point, whilst also respecting that, where I put my flag is different to where you put your flag, but they're both right. Which trying to explain that without confusing people gets really difficult. Right. But what generally doesn't work is taking what I think is a great training plan, taking what he thinks is a great training plan, going, well, I'll do half of that and half of
no, that's a problem.
That doesn't work, right? That's when stuff starts going wrong. But if you obey all the rules of the system, whatever that system is, they all work.
Yeah, I think that's better. I may be ignorant on this one. I think that's better today, because I used to call that program hopping, during the ebook decades, where everybody had the 10-week program, 12-week program, whatever it was. They would go from one program, right? It could be completely different, vastly different. It's like, oh shit. It's like none of these programs should be 12 weeks, by the way. No. That's just a few blocks that should, extend out from that. And I think we've gotten further and further away from that as online coaching has grown and grown and grown. The answer to that would be, how long does your average client stay with you, right? If it's 12 weeks, then I'm incorrect, but I don't think that's the case.
No. And I think as a coach, you just have to plan beyond that anyway. Like if you're always looking for quick wins with a client, you'll get them, but then what do you do? Eventually their long-term progress will stall, because you're only going 12 weeks at a time, right? So you almost create a self-fulfilling prophecy there, I feel, because you'll get great results for 12 weeks and then it will be stagnant or whatever. Whereas, if someone buys in for long enough, they'll see the results that they're probably not getting elsewhere.
Yeah.
So I think coaches maybe who set up with that model almost create a rod for their own back in that regard, and then, that same client is starting to think, well, why am I paying you $200 a month when I can get a 12-week program for $80, $60, whatever it might be. And I know enough now, I can just take out back squat and put front squat because I prefer that or whatever. The value of a coach is, it's like with nutrition coaching, you can correct me if you think this is wrong, but when someone hires you as a nutrition coach, you're not paying for the diet plan that you start with. You're paying for how they adjust it based on how you react to it as time goes on. And it's the exact same with the training program. The skeleton that you start with is, I've done the best I can with the information I have. Now we go and see how you react, and we tinker, which is usually why the relationship and the training should get more productive as it goes on. And I think it's the same with the diet there. You're not really paying for that initial diet and like, oh great, the coaching's done now. The coach's job is the objective tweaks that they make along the way that you're probably not able to make.
Yes.
A lot of the times too, I feel like, especially when you get a new client, and then also with clients you've had for a long time, it's really important to have sort of ongoing conversations to sort of set expectations. So if I sit down with a client and they tell me, hey, so I actually just got a new client, I think like the other day or whatever, he messaged me, signed up or whatever. And so he's not a competitive athlete, but he's pretty strong. And he's like, oh yeah, I want to deadlift like 750. And he's at like, I think 630 right now. Right. And so I was like, okay, cool. When someone has like a certain goal, and let's say it's a long-term goal, a short-term goal, whatever, like I think it's really important to set the expectations, because a lot of the times when you start working with someone, not every time, but a lot of the times when you start working with someone, you're probably not going to start tackling like that goal exactly the way they think you are, because you're thinking more long-term. You're like, okay, these are the things that I'm seeing that you have an issue with. In order to get here, we need to first address this and this and this. Then once we do that, then we can start building out more exactly like what you were saying. You kind of have like this starting point. And for instance, if you're going to someone, so if I'm with someone and they want to like build a bunch of muscle, but they're like 20% body fat, I'm like, okay, first we need to get you lean, right? Because if you're 20% and we start a bulk, let's say you gain 15 pounds. I have zero idea if you've gained any muscle. You know, even if we gain at, you know, quote unquote, an appropriate rate, I don't know how much muscle you've gained because you just look you're too fat. I can't tell. Right. Whereas if we lean you out, and then first of all, while we're leaning you out, I really like to use that time as well to get the discipline, get the consistency, get the adherence, and then test it out through planned deviation. And that way, when you finish your cut, you've got all the requisite skill sets. So now that you can bulk and you're not going to get over fat, right? Because the worst freaking thing in the world is getting lean and then bulking. So being super lean, having abs, all that stuff. And then you bulk up and you're like, yeah, you just lost everything because you didn't have that base, you didn't have that skill set. And that sucks. And I've done that a lot in the past. And so, you know, having that conversation about like, okay, if this is your goal, we'll probably need to take this route, but this is why we're taking this route. Here's all the steps along the way. And that's a very, very different conversation than someone who's like, hey, I've got this comp coming up in 16 weeks and I just want you to peak me for it. It's like, that's not a lot of time, especially if you're with a brand new like athlete, not brand new to them, but brand new to you as a coach. You've got to figure a lot of stuff out, but then at the same time, you kind of have to be conservative in some elements, because you don't want to just fuck up their peak experimenting and trying new stuff, because you don't have a whole lot of data to work with unless they have like a very extensive catalog of all their training history and stuff like that, which most people just don't. And so I think those conversations are super, super important, because they sort of set the foundation. And that way, when they come to you later on being like, hey, I feel like I'm not, you know, doing this, you know, what's going on? You can be like, hey, remember when we talked about this? We're not there yet. We're still in this phase, you know, and you can kind of talk them off the ledge sometimes, because everyone gets a little, like, I get antsy sometimes, especially when I get to the last 2 weeks of the block. All I want to do is get to the next program, you know, and I think that's kind of a feeling, maybe not, I don't know, maybe I'm just talking for myself, but I think that, you know, some other people kind of have a similar mentality when you're like, you're doing like an 8 or 10 week block. You're just like, okay, I'm kind of done with this. I just want something new. Kind of like how when you get to the end of your comp prep, you're just like, I just want to compete and be over with. Like, you're just kind of done with it. And so, yeah, I think those conversations are super, super important, but they can really, really bolster their adherence. They can bolster their skill set. They can bolster, just the actual skill acquisition, because they really know what they're supposed to be doing throughout the entire thing. They know what they're trying to get out of it, and they know how that phase or block or whatever is going to facilitate better outcomes in the next phase. And so they can kind of put all those pieces together, you know, a lot more effectively.
Well, I think that it's kind of going back to what we were talking to earlier, just in a more concise way, because if we look at, you have to be realistic of where you are, right? So a coach can help with that, or the person just needs to really think about where they are. So to use myself as an example, I always have one thing that I want to do before the end of the year, right? And it's a squat, and it's going to be stupid, and it's just what I am, right? And so, but once that phase is over, it could be November, whatever, it slides. Then when I'm looking at the next year, I got to be realistic. Like, for me to go back and to beat that again the next following year, where am I currently now? Like, what's fucked up? What's beat up? You know, how much time do I need to back away from all this to let everything heal? And then being older, how can I, yes, I can put muscle on, but it's more about not losing muscle, because there's losing weight as well throughout the whole thing. And it's, once you start thinking this all through, you start realize it's going to be November. I don't have enough time to do this in 6 months. Otherwise, I'm going to skip something, you know. Then if I skip something, I'm going to pay a price, you know. So it's having the realistic expectations of, you know, going from a 630 to a 750. That's cool, right? And for some people, maybe that can happen in a year, but are you even in shape to even start training hard enough to do the 630 again? Like, when did you do the 630? You know, like, where is all this? And when you're dealing with putting on muscle mass, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, if you're already 20% or higher, then good luck with your compliance, because there's a lot of shitty habits that you already have that have to be addressed. So if you start cutting, it's going to be harder for them because more habits need to change, right? But they'll see the difference. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. Especially that 20%, they're going to lose, I don't know how big this person is, 14 pounds in the first 2 weeks, just blowing water out and all the other stuff. Yeah. And then they progressively see they look better and better and better. That's better neural feedback for somebody to learn how to eat clean and eat correctly. Then we're going to start here and just go up and hope your body fat doesn't go up more. Good luck. How's that gonna go? But you can't see, but the client can't see either. You know what I'm saying? So if they did put on 10 pounds of lean body mass under 22% body fat, what are they going to see? Maybe a bicep vein. You know what I'm saying is maybe at best what they're going to see is what they look like pumped. If there's even any change when they do get pumped, which there may not be. Either way, the habits have to be ingrained, so, and if that's happening, and as there's dieting down, that deadlift more likely isn't going to be going up radically. Maybe if technical issues and stuff like that, it will be, but as soon as they maintain and hopefully come out good, I've done what you've done as well, put on 40 pounds in a week after a cut. Look great, by the way, for the first 7 days, right? You're like, what the hell? And 7 more days, you're like a slob. It spills over. But that just makes that peak even better. Because then they're incrementally taking the weight back up to put muscle on. And it's there. But selling them on that, how do you go about doing that? Because there's another coach out there that's promising that 730 pound deadlift in 10 weeks.
So I think one of the things I'm pretty good at is just communication. So when I'm talking to people, they can tell that I know what I'm talking about because they'll have questions, I answer them. They have questions, I'm not like, well, this is just the, you know what I mean? I give them very clear and concise instructions. Also, like if I'm on a coaching call with someone and let's say a prospect, not an existing client, I'll usually show them some of my athletes. And so it's like, I've got, and like before and afters, both of their physique, but then also like their numbers and stuff like that. I'll show them that and I'll be like, look, this is what I've done. This is what I can do. And I also like collect a lot of data on my clients. And so like, there's certain things like on my current client roster, like 83% of them have a 6-pack. And they did not have a 6-pack when they came to me. They were like big old freaking pot belly powerlifters, And so it's just like a lot of the photos that I have in my current client roster, it's just like abs. And then you see their before photo and they're just these big, guys and girls. And then it's like, I'll show them the number of international elite athletes I have, the number of national records and whatever.
If you're serious about your training goals, you know what you put in your body matters. We also know the supplement industry is a complete mess. This is why we've partnered with First Detachment, and they are the sponsor of today's episode. Whether you want to lose fat, build muscle and strength, or just boost your overall health, First Detachment has something for you, ranging from pre and intra-workout, fat burner, kidney and liver support, and nighttime recovery, all designed with performance in mind. If you care about what goes into your supplements, and you should, you'll be glad that First Detachment prioritizes clean, effective ingredients without any unnecessary fillers or artificial additives. Plus, I have known one of the owners for over 2 decades, and Justin Harris is not one to cut corners and someone I've always trusted with advice on training, nutrition, and supplements. Head over to firstdetachment.com and check out their full lineup. As a special offer for Table Talk listeners, use the code TABLETALK at checkout for a 10% discount on your first order.
And like things like that. And so I think both of those things together are really, really big in terms of just being like, okay, I'm bought in. And then also I just show them like my photo. of like, so the last time I was on here, that was at the very end of my cut. I went from like 287 to, I think I was 230 or something like that when I was in here. And I was like, I got to toss on a sweater. I can't be that skinny on video. So now I'm like 263. I just finished my bulk. But I think a lot of those things kind of tend to build up credibility, because it's like I'm saying stuff, but then you actually also see an outcome, right? So not only am I like, quote, making sense, but there's actually something to verify that. And then I think another huge piece, and this is actually, we were talking about this the other day, is I made a nutrition course. So since I left on my own, previously, obviously I was director of education. So I would develop a lot of educational curriculum for Kabuki, for other organizations. And I love that. That's probably one of the things that I'm most passionate about. But I was constrained in terms of what I could do. So for instance, I'm not going to name the organization, but there was an organization that they were like, hey, we want you to develop a certificate program for our coaches. And I was like, all right, cool. And in the end, it was about 40 hours. Super, super technical. It was going to take people to a very high level who were novice coaches. And even if you're an advanced coach, it's going to really, really bolster your education, your application of things. And they were like, this is too much, and we don't want to intimidate people from taking this. So can you just make it 8 hours? And so I just was like, I just gave the project to someone else. I was like, you can use this, but I don't want my name on it, And so now that I have my own company, I can do whatever the fuck I want. So I built out a nutrition course, and I hired a whole production team. I bought a recording studio, and I basically just have been recording and releasing 1 to 2 lectures every single week, and it's all free on YouTube. Right. And so one of my main reasons for doing that is because I just noticed that I focus so much on education, but I also have the exact same conversations with clients. I'm sure it's like, oh, why do I need to do this? And you're like, I should probably just record a video on this so I can just send it to them. And I've been thinking about that for a long time. And I was like, why don't I just make a course and put it out there? So I developed this course, and I think the first maybe 6 or 7 videos or something like that are out there, but I'm releasing 1 or 2 every week. And it's on nutrition, it's on behavior change, and it's like super, super in depth. And so that's one of the things that whenever I get a new client, I tell them about them, and I'm like, hey, I want you to go through this series, especially behavior change, the module, because that's such a huge thing about understanding like who you are, how you respond to different things, how you're going to respond to coaching, what the thought process is behind everything. And a lot of the times I think that people react sort of instinctively or just like emotionally. They don't necessarily think, like, people are not super logical all the times. And that lends you to making bad decisions. And especially if you're someone who program hops, especially if you're someone who, is really good with your diet for a period and then you jump off, or, everyone kind of has their own problems. And I've gone through a lot of those problems myself. But if you are that kind of person and then you go and take this course, you just have like aha moment after aha moment where you're like, oh, that's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm doing that. And then it's like, now we actually have behavior change techniques to implement that and see a direct difference in your life. Like, it's not, oh, if you do this 10 years down the road, you're going to see a difference. It's like, no, you can implement this right now and see a difference right now. You might not lose 50 pounds in that immediate moment, but you're going to be like, oh, the unproductive behavior that's causing me to gain weight or preventing me from losing weight or whatever it might be, this is directly going to influence that in a positive way. And so I'm doing that for nutrition. I'm probably going to do the same thing for training. I don't know. We'll kind of see how this goes, but that's a huge, huge aspect, is just education. I try and educate the shit out of everyone. Even if I'm doing a video review, like, I'm drawing on the videos, I'm talking over it. I'm like, hey, so the joint angle's here, and like the cable's here. Even if people are still novice, I will still go in that in depth, because it's important for them to understand it. Because if their execution is super high level, then they're just going to get much, much better outcomes. And so I spend a lot of time educating just constantly on everything.
Where do you start with the behavior change? Because that's a big ask. Let me change the question. Where with most people, what is the first thing that they need to address with the behavior change? Because when you say they need to figure out who they are. Right. There's people that will go to therapy for 4 decades and never figure that one out.
Yeah, man, I've got my thoughts on therapy as well. A lot of that's bullshit. So I think the biggest thing is ultimately, if you can sort of measure how accurately you are oriented towards the truth by your outcomes. Like, if I think I'm a better coach than you, then I just look at my roster and I look at your roster. And then I'm like, oh, Dave's a better coach than me because he has way more athletes than I do. He's got way more high level athletes. And so that's pretty simple. It's, irrefutable. So if you're like, oh, I know what to do to lose weight, but you can't lose weight, then it's like, well, you don't know what to do then. It's as simple as that. And people try and complicate it, but it's as simple as that. If you think you're a 10 and you're amazing and every woman should just be on their knees begging to be with you, but you can't get a girlfriend, then you suck and you're not a 10. It's as simple as that, and people don't like to hear it, but that's the truth. So for me, one of the big things that I start with is I tell them that. I'm like, if you don't have the outcome that you want, it's because you don't know enough, because when people there's a big difference between a conceptual understanding and an understanding that comes through integration and knowledge, I understood, and we talked about this last time, I understood training to failure, but I understood it through such a narrow lens until I actually started training to failure. And then I was like, oh man, okay, I get it now, but I needed to go through that in order to actually understand it. And so a lot of the times people have these preconceptions around what's required, what you need to do, what's the important thing, what's the unimportant thing. And so for me, I just talk to them about where they're at. I listen to what they say. And a lot of the times people kind of reveal it in how they talk about a certain situation. And I'm like, okay, we need to focus on, one, your perspective on how this process actually looks, because it doesn't look how you're telling me, right? So I'll educate them on that. And the biggest thing is just, I'll tell people to suspend disbelief temporarily. So you go watch a movie and you suspend your disbelief in the sense that you're watching Star Wars or some sci-fi movie, but you get enthralled, you get sucked in. Right? You're not thinking, oh, well, people can't actually move things with their mind and blah, blah, blah. You're not thinking that. You're just engaged in the film. And that's kind of what I ask people to do with me. I'm like, hey, you might not agree with some of the stuff I say, but just test it. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. But if it does work, then maybe open your mind to some of the other concepts that I'm going to share with you. And I'll usually start really small with something pretty easy to give them some wins right off the bat. And so that way they can be like, oh, hey, wow, this is a problem that I had for a really long time, and now I just fixed it, or I have at least a single solution for it. Maybe there's other things that I can learn too. So great example of this is specific to nutrition. I had a client recently who I was talking to, and she's newer, and so she would eat when she's bored. Just all the time, not even when she's hungry, she just eats when she's bored. And so one of the things I said is, okay, I don't actually want you to change that behavior. I don't want you to stop eating when you're bored. All I want you to do is, instead of eating cookies when you're bored, I just want you to load up on fruit and veggies. Eat as much fruit and veggies as you want. I don't give a shit. And she did that. And she was like, oh, wow. It was crazy because I did what you said and I didn't have any sort of compulsions to continue eating. I actually felt satisfied. And that might sound weird, right? Because especially you see this meme and it's like, oh, when you're hungry, just reach for an apple. And then, there's a comment underneath where it's like, well, an apple doesn't taste like red velvet cake, you fucking idiot. And that's true, but it's also a misunderstanding of how your neurobiology works. So there's a reward mechanism. And a lot of the times the reward initially is associated with the food. So you eat the food, it's calorically dense, it's hyper palatable, you have an actual an increase in dopamine. There's a physiological response to it that you get the reward from. But then over time, you get diminishing returns. So that reward association is now more so linked with the behavior as opposed to the actual food that you're eating. So for her, because this was a really well-ingrained habit, we need to de-encode that behavior. And one of the ways of doing that is just changing the behavior. Or sorry, not changing the behavior, but changing one particular aspect. So the behavior remains the same, but we just change the object of the behavior. So we're eating fruit instead of a cookie. And it's like, is that a long-term solution? No, but it's a really, really effective way to drastically reduce her total caloric load. If this is something she's doing on a regular basis, she's getting more fiber in, she's getting more micronutrients in, she's getting full, and she's like, you can eat 2 pounds of fruit and that's 200 calories. You know what I mean? It's really hard to get, I don't think anyone's ever gotten fat from eating fruit. I know people talk about, oh, it's high in sugar. It's like, dude, shut the fuck up. No one gets fat from eating fruit. Come on. And so, that's a really simple win, but that's a win for her where it's like, wow, this is something I've struggled with for years. And he gave me this technique and it really worked. And that's not something you forget. And so then from there, that builds a huge amount of trust. And it's like, okay, what do we do next? Right. And then that kind of builds off of that. So I try and give people wins, but I also try and tell people, if you've been struggling with this, you just don't know enough. If I can't get stronger, if I can't get bigger, it's because I don't know enough. And that's just the truth. I just have to admit that,
Yeah,
sure. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it answers the question, but it's knowing what to learn becomes the next question, because if you don't know enough, then there's a skill that you lack.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have to decide which skill that you have to work on. And that would be where the next mistake can happen, because they're going to want to go to the skill they may already know a little bit about.
Yeah.
Because that's where their comfort level is. Say if it's marketing, branding, whatever it's going to be, from a business side, they're going to go, well, I already know a little bit about this. I just need to do more there. But the problem may actually be one of the others that they know zero about. Yeah. And so a coach can help with that, because you can navigate what skill to start with, because it doesn't mean that's going to be the actual acquired skill that's going to help either, right? It could still be the wrong one.
Yeah, a lot of times it's just a bridge.
Yeah, but it's a priority of knowing that. But I think in some cases, if people are aware of that, that's the hesitancy to be able to jump, is because if they're not progressing, and business is probably a better one. If the business isn't growing, then there's so many other skills, that could be attributed to doing that. Then they're like, fuck it. They either just don't do anything, or they default to the thing that they probably don't need to work on.
Yeah.
Because that's what they like to do.
And so you brought something up that actually is also super relevant, and that's the time course to see a result, right? So for instance, if you make an investment in so this podcast, right? How do you determine your actual ROI, right? Mm-hmm. It's like you can have a lot of indirect methods, and you can have other things that maybe are a little bit more direct, but you probably can't quantify in totality with precision what the ROI is on this podcast. Also, if you started the podcast before you were already established brand, how long would you have to do that before it turns over? You know what I mean? So it's like there's long-term investments, there's short-term investments, and knowing which one's which, and what we're going to do, and how it's going to produce an outcome later on, and how it's going to facilitate growth in other aspects of your business is super important. And with nutrition, with training, all that stuff, it comes in, because again, like you were talking about earlier, not taking that time after a meet. And how many times have you heard someone go in and they're like, oh man, I had a great meet. I feel phenomenal. I'm getting right back into training. Boom, they blow their hamstring out. It's like, okay, but you can't feel your tendons. You can't feel your ligaments. You can't feel your bones in the same way. But you still need to do these things, but that's more of a long-term perspective when you're training and your longevity. But because the reward's not immediate, a lot of the times it's difficult to make those associations. Or like you were saying, you're doing the right thing, but in the wrong context. Yeah. And so it's not, but it's not that that's the wrong thing. It's just you're applying it incorrectly. And so, that's why I think the value of the coach really comes in, because they can say, hey, we need to just tweak this. Sometimes it's just a subtle tweak. Sometimes they give you one thing and it's like that solves everything, and then boom, everything just blows up. Sometimes you need to do a lot of things before you can kind of gain enough momentum to really see that turnover. And there's all sorts of different contextual issues that can be very difficult to communicate. And that's why, that was literally the reason why we were talking about the nutrition thing, right? Is because this is like a really heavy applied science nutrition course that I made, because there's a lot of courses out there. I've seen them, or I've been part of developing them, and they're all really good. But kind of the example I gave him yesterday was, you look at precision nutrition or something like that, and it's like, it's really good. They have a whole course on biochemistry and all this other stuff, and you have all this information, but then it's like, okay, now what? So you hear people talking about hypertrophy. Oh, the rep range is between 5 and 50, and you got to hang out between 60 and 80% and blah, blah, blah. So you have all this information. Then it's like, okay, cool, but write me a program. And that's, I think, where a lot of the times education sort of drops the ball. Is they're great at communicating the science, but they're not great at communicating like applied science. So how do you actually apply it? How do you actually design a program? What are, several different models or progression strategies you can use? And so that was one thing that I really, really went heavy on in this one, because I really want people to actually understand that stuff, because then when you do anything, it's just going to be so much more effective if you know how to apply it and if you understand the context, especially if you understand your own context. Because how many people are just oblivious of their own situation, and they're like, I can't lose weight because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And then all of a sudden they find out, oh, apparently environmental factors are not a rate limiting factor. I don't need optimal conditions. I just need sufficient conditions. But even that concept is foreign to people. They're so willing to blame their genetics and say all of these things are the reason why they can't lose weight, or the reason why they can't get strong. And it's like, one of the things I talk about in one of the videos actually is like, the NIH says that, the National Institute of Health says that like in the last 60 years, we've seen like a massive increase. Like I think it's tripled or quadrupled or something like that, the rates of obesity and being overweight. Can't remember the exact numbers, but it's like an astronomical figure. Now we have Americans, 75%, more than 75% of Americans are either overweight or obese. And it's like just in the last 60 years, we've seen massive increase. And so it's like, okay, don't really see a big difference in geography. We don't really see a big difference in genetics, because genetics can't evolve that rapidly. We don't see a big difference in all these things. And so it's like, okay, there's technology, but there's there's sociocultural issues, big issues in technology and agricultural and food processing and things like that. But even still, all of those things are not sufficient to actually, their explanatory power is insufficient, because in any of those one scenarios, you have fit people and you have unfit people.
Yeah.
And so if someone's going into something under a false premise, there's no way they're going to be able to get the outcome, because they believe that, in order to get lean, I have to cut out carbs. So they cut out carbs and they get lean, or they get leaner, but then they're like, well, I still need to lose 15 pounds. I lost 20, but I need to lose 15 more. Okay, well, what do? You just cut out all your carbs. So, where do you go? Because they're acting under a false premise, and they kind of hit that roadblock. Same thing with like training.
Well, so just out of interest, because when I hear stats like that, the first thing that comes to my mind is, how did the definition change over the 60 years?
Of obesity or overweight?
Yeah. Like, so how are they defining obesity 60 years ago to how are they defining it today? Because sometimes we see giant spikes in certain things just because they change the way that they're actually defining it. Testosterone rates being an example recently, where low T used to be under 300. Now low T is under 100, so boom, it shows this giant increase in testosterone, low testosterone rates, but they changed the definition. Not saying that we're not more obese. I mean, we can just clearly look around and see, that's true, but that's my default, where when I hear things like that, that's the first thing that comes to my brain is, okay, I want to go see how it was defined then and how it's defined now. In almost all cases, there's a change in how it's being defined. But normally that change in how it's being defined will show an increase, not a decrease. But that's not to say that they couldn't change the definition a year from now, and then say obesity rates have been cut by 50% because they changed the way it was being defined.
We've seen that happen quite a few times. So.
Yes. But anyhow, continue with what you're saying.
What I wanted to ask, if you don't mind, was just kind of backtracking a little bit. When you're dealing with behavioral change in individuals, you kind of got that dichotomy between blame and responsibility, right? So a lot of people will be, I struggle to eat well or train because I work night shifts, or I've got 2 kids, or whatever, or because every time I go in Walmart, there's candy bars everywhere, right? You can blame whatever you want, but you're still responsible for your actions in that context, right? So how do you get people to bridge that gap and kind of accept the mantle of responsibility, and maybe people who are kind of resilient to do so? Because that's obviously a big part of it, right? We could all sit around and probably make quite a nice long list of things that could stop us from training and eating well, whatever it might be, but at the end of the day, our actions are responsibilities. And once you kind of grasp that and take responsibility for that, that's when you can really see change. So how do you kind of go about getting people to take that difficult step?
Yeah. So, obviously there's lots of different personality types, and you have to approach everyone a little bit differently, but I think there's a couple common threads among all clients. And it sounds super fucking lame saying it, but it's just compassion. Like I have a lot of clients. So I have 2 in particular right now. I won't say their name. They're relatively new. I think they've been only working with me for maybe like a month and a half. It's a husband and wife. They work incredibly hard. They're incredibly disciplined. Also very self-critical, right? So if they fuck up once, if they do anything that deviates from the program, they're like, oh, I'm just this, I'm this, I'm this. And it's like, dude, you're doing great. Relax. So I think for people who are super self-critical, you need to give a lot of positive reinforcement and just be like, hey, you're doing great. Like, relax, and because especially if their behavior's trending in a good direction, you don't really need to worry about that much. You just need to get their head in the right space. Whereas if someone is just constantly messing up and constantly making excuses, I think you still need to be compassionate and always like validate what it is they're saying, what it is they're feeling, but then at the same time, force responsibility. So if someone gives like an excuse, or if someone tells me something like, oh, well, I think I kind of have to put things on hold for a little bit because I'm going on vacation, or I'm going traveling for X amount of months, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, cool. So like, what are you going to do the next time this happens? You're just going to stop again? You know, like every time something comes up, you're just going to stop training, or you're going to stop dieting or whatever. Like, you're probably not really going to get very far because you don't understand how to adapt it. It's like the people who see the outcomes that you want are the people who don't stop. They just consistently go in, and they treat it more like a volume knob that they turn down and up depending on what their circumstances. And so I try and get people out of that headspace. Again, a lot of education, but then also knowing when to call people out for shit and knowing when to sort of back off a little bit. And I think if you're compassionate towards people, and if you are positively reinforcing them, like I really try and reinforce a lot of my clients when they're doing a great job. So if I give them like a technical cue and then they correct it, I'm like, dude, these look so much better. Like, really, really happy with how you've done this. I like how you're, sorry, I'm like drawing on my phone when I'm doing this. So I'm recording a video of them lifting, and I'm drawing, and we have like graphs and all this stuff. And I'll be like, I love how you're doing this. You see how you're driving your heels into the ground right now, and what that's doing to your upper back. It's allowing you to keep your position, blah, blah, blah. See how when the bar touched, it didn't do. So like, I'll always try and praise as much as I can when it's earned. I'm not just going to bullshit people, but if they're actually doing a good job, I want them to know they're doing a good job, and I want them to see their wins, because that's super important for them to actually start believing themselves. And even for like experienced athletes, like there's sometimes those guys don't need it as much, but I still want to be positive and reinforce them, just so that they can actually understand their own development. Because especially if you're more advanced, you don't really respond as well to, and this has actually been researched, you don't generally tend to respond as well to like praise. You respond more to constructive criticism. And so I'll give the constructive criticism, but then I'll still praise them in ways so that they can see, oh shit, yeah, he's right. I am improving. Yes, my squat has been getting better. Or else they just tend to ignore all that stuff. They're just like, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? And I think this is a really good mentality to get better, but you need to kind of balance it out. So lots of praise when it's earned, not bullshit, being authentic, and having those conversations with them about what you think. Like, there are some times where people will tell me something and I'll be like, hey, I'll be honest, I actually think you're full of shit. I don't want to overstep, but this is my genuine perspective. I don't think that what you said is what you actually believe, because it's antithetical to your behavior. What I suspect is this is what's going on. I could be wrong, but I'd love to have a conversation about this, but I think the only reason why I'm able to call people out on stuff like that is because I create a good relationship. Yeah, because I create that good relationship. And then when I do that, they're like, oh, fuck, wow, you know what? You're right. I'm so sorry, blah, blah, blah. And then I can do that. And so I think it's like really just a process of trusting another person as opposed to just kind of shitting on them.
Sure.
And
do you think it comes down to education and to a little bit of degree? Because you said the kind of degree
education's huge,
that you go into with your explanations and stuff. So, if I'm diet coach A, I give you your diet plan. It's just do this. And if you don't do it to 100%, it's like tough shit. And I tweak every week for you and no explanation. Whereas if I give you diet coach B, he gives you the diet plan. These are the macros. This is the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
Diet coach B is giving them the information that maybe allows them to be adaptable over time. Whereas maybe the client who's got diet coach A doesn't even know rice is a carb, for example. So then when they go on vacation, they're lost, right? Yeah. Whereas if you're giving them the raw information with the plan, slowly over time, maybe they learn stuff without even realizing that they're learning it, right? And then they go out for dinner and they're like, well, rice and pasta are kind of interchangeable, or whatever it might be. So chicken and turkey or whatever. Right. And that allows them maybe then to take responsibility for changing that meal, as opposed to being on their phone texting you at 10 p.m. or whatever it might be.
Education's huge. And that was one of the reasons, like I said, why I made the course, because I want them to have that as a resource so they can go through all of it. And that way they can just understand what we're doing. So like, even if someone doesn't want to learn, like I coach quite a few coaches, and they're always like super eager to learn, but like even the people who just generally don't give a crap, they don't care about learning, they just want the outcome, I will still do that in my check-ins, in my video reviews and everything. Because even if they don't care about learning, when you just hear something over and over and over again, and you get into a conversation and someone will ask you a question, you're like, oh, well, because of this. And you're like, huh, I didn't realize that I knew that, but it's just because I'm like drilling it into their heads. So education's so freaking important. Like I cannot stress how important it is, because if you don't know, then like, what are you going to do? You know, like even like anyone who sees a therapist, anyone who does anything like that, one of the first things you do is like education. It's like, okay, you know, you have some symptoms. This is kind of what our diagnostic tools tells us about people who present with these symptoms in these contexts. And so you may likely have ADD or PTSD or whatever it might be. And here's what you might experience. And so it's like when you can explain to someone their problems better than they can, all of a sudden they're like, oh, he gets it. Okay. Like, it's like, he just told me exactly how I felt. And that's such a deep thing for me. And so, yeah, I think the education component is really, really huge, because then that facilitates change in behavior. Like if you're just giving instructions, they don't understand why they're doing that, you know? And so they won't be able to adapt. And like even things like planned deviation. So if someone goes on vacation, I'll intentionally use that as a time to deviate from their diet, right? And or their training, depending on what's going on, right? This is more for someone who's like more body composition focused and like a performance athlete, but because I want to test their ability. It's like, hey, we've learned a lot of stuff. We've implemented a lot of skills. You have a lot of resources. Let's see how you can do it in more of a free living scenario without that control. I don't want you to track calories. I just want you to do this. And then we look at their body weight when they come back. We look at all this different stuff and we see how effective they were. Right. And so that's a really great litmus test every now and then if someone's traveling or going on vacation, doing a little work event or whatever, to test their actual ability. And I'll always tell them why I want them to do that beforehand and what I expect to happen. And then what the potential, like, it's like, okay, we might see this, or we might see that. And that way they know what to expect. So if they gain a little bit of weight, I can just say, hey, you gain a little bit of weight, not to worry. Let's wait this week. And I suspect that by the end of the week, you're probably going to be even 1 pound lighter than when you left. And all of a sudden they lose a bunch of water weight. And it's like, oh shit, like I didn't actually gain weight. It was just water weight. And it was this and it was that, and, you know, additional food content because I was eating out and it's different foods. And so my body's responding a little bit differently. And then they understand that, like, it closes that feedback loop. And so they understand what that process looks like. So yeah, I'm probably, I talk too much.
But do you think a lot of coaches maybe are scared to do that because they're worried the client then won't need them? Or do you think maybe it's just a, for want of a better word, a laziness issue, or too many clients to deal with to put that kind of time in, perhaps?
I don't know. I mean, I don't suspect to really know why people coach in a particular way. So I can't really speak on that.
What I'm saying, what the level so that you go into there in terms of detail is probably fair to say it's quite unusual or rare amongst coaches.
Maybe, yeah.
So, you know, what do you think the differentiator might be there?
Well, I do know that people sometimes get scared that someone's going to leave, right? But to me, that just never made any sense, because it's like, you've written a bunch of articles and books. I've read almost all of them. I've listened to most of the podcasts. There's not a chance in hell I will ever be able to execute to the same degree that you will. You've got so much more experience than me, right? It's like if you have 2 recipes and you give one to Gordon Ramsay and then you do one, it's like all the instructions are right there. You have all the ingredients, you have all the tools, you know how to do it. Let's say you're out of culinary school, right? So just out of culinary school, you know all of the basic things you need to be able to do, but there's no way you can execute at the same level as that guy because he's a master at this. So I'm not worried about any of my clients taking a course or learning everything from me and then fucking off and stealing, or like a coach. So especially because I coach coaches, I'm not worried about them ripping my shit and then going and coaching someone else the same way. If they do that, that's fantastic. I don't care because I know what I know. And also it's like, I think my personality and my approach is just, I don't think you can replicate that. Like I could learn everything you know, and sorry, I didn't mean that to sound arrogant. I just mean hypothetically, right? But there's no way I'm going to be able to replicate how you deliver that service or how you communicate it or how you guys interact with your clients or how you make certain decisions. There's just no way. And so I'm a big believer of like, just give them the best outcome and do everything you can for them to make them self-sufficient and all that stuff. And like, if you do that, why would they leave?
No,
if I'm getting phenomenal results and my coach like really cares about me and is always there for me, I'm not going to be like, well, now that I know everything, peace, motherfucker. You know what I mean? I'm like, there's going to be a sense of loyalty there too. And so I think it's kind of silly when people worry about that stuff. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe, you know, but that's just my opinion on it. So.
Well, if they leave because they know everything, then I would see that as a referral source. Yeah. Right. Because if you took them from here to here, and then they're like, good. I'm cool. I got it. They run in circles where people are not going to be at the level that they're at because they're going to be at a higher level because they've been coached for 3 years. And then they're going to be apt to say, you know, work with Daniel.
Yeah.
They're going to say that before they're going to say, go work with somebody else.
Yeah.
You know, so there's the back end of all that. On the coaching side, maybe not so much, but all the qualities that you spoke about speak more to the art of coaching than the science of, because you can have the science of coaching down packed, but if you can't communicate it, good luck.
Yeah.
Right. My question though would be with all the education would be the compliance. You know, is you can have these videos and they're half-hour videos, but if somebody's hiring you, there's a good chance I'm hiring you because I don't want to know this shit.
Yeah.
Just tell me what to do. And that's going to make up a certain demographic. But if you're feeding it to them in updates in small little bits without them really knowing, that's kind of doing that to where I could see them, no, I'm not going to go watch this hour video on whatever this is. Why should I watch that? He's my coach. He'll take care of that. And so I can see a disconnect with that, but I don't see it as being a disadvantage. You know, having more education can't be a disadvantage in any way, unless all you're doing is producing content and education and not working with clients.
Yeah.
Right. Because then there's how you're going to get more clients.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was actually something that I really thought a lot about because I have no problem listening to 3-4 hour lecture. Like if I'm like in it, I'm enthralled the whole time. But I know people aren't always like that. And so that's why I got the production team. And that's why most of the lectures are between like, I want to say 10 minutes and 30 minutes. 40 minutes, maybe tops. So even if I have just one lecture, she'll cut it up maybe into 2 videos if it's a little longer. And she makes them look like, I literally told her, I was like, copy Alex Hormozi. I was like, his videos, his like, 40-minute videos where they have like, different images coming in. It's like, it's engaging. There's like lots of stuff going on. So that's how they cut it up. And because I wanted people to be more engaged, so they're not just bored listening to some dude talking. And I think they did a phenomenal job. So that was a really, really big emphasis because I wanted to be more applicable. And that's also why like a lot of it is an applied science, not just here's just a bunch of data and go do whatever you want with it. So I tried to take that into account. I hope people enjoy it, but I'm not expecting everyone to watch it. And I'm sure there's people who are like, oh yeah, I watched it. I loved it. And they're just full of shit.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's okay too. Like I just wanted it to be there as a resource because I think it's incredibly helpful when you start understanding your own situation, because then you can really make some profound changes. Like I know for me, there were certain things that I was struggling with for a very long time. And it wasn't until I actually got like a diagnosis of something where I was like, oh, my whole life makes more sense now. And then from there, it was just like, I was able to just do so much more because I actually understood what was going on and what my limitations were. And I think a lot of people are just sort of behaving, especially when it comes around nutrition. Because I think most people, training's not that hard, like most people who train like training. You go in, it's like an hour, 2 hours, whatever of your day. And there's not a lot of people really lack the discipline to make into the gym who are part of this culture anyways. That's usually the really fun part. The shitty part is the dieting, and so I think that a lot of the behavior change stuff is way more relevant to nutrition than it is training because most people just don't struggle with training, at least in my opinion. So
conversely, why do you think we struggle with behavior change and nutrition? What do you think has created that issue? And I'm sure that's a very long-winded answer. But
yeah, it is. I mean, so there's actually a whole section of one of the videos where I talk about all these things, but I think it boils down to probably there's a lot of different factors, but the ones that I think are most important in my mind are like the sociocultural issues, So there are certain countries, like when I was in Serbia, and a lot of countries in the world, it's not socially acceptable to be fat. It's just not. And you don't see the same obesity rates over there as you do over here. Whereas here you have body positivity, you have like just culturally, it's okay to overeat. No one's going to say anything about being fat, and whatever. And it's even like now harmful apparently to say that being over fat is bad for your health, and which is ridiculous. So whereas in other places, like there's an actual stigma around being fat, and it's like, it's not good for your health and you don't want to be that way. And so that's a really, really big thing. Also, just the lifestyle that people have is another huge thing. So you look at, you look at Amish communities, and Amish communities have like They take like 5 times as many steps. So they're way more physically active throughout the day. They don't have the same access to technology, obviously. They don't eat ultra processed foods, or at least not as much, right? And it's like you look at the obesity and overweight. I think overweight population is like 50 or 40 something percent, and then obesity and overweight is like is over 75 collectively. But then you look at the obesity rates in Amish communities, and it's like, or in this particular paper that I'm referencing, sorry, and there might be variability around other communities, but in the particular paper that I'm talking about, I can't remember the citation off the top of my head, but I go over in the video, is 0 to like 1.9%, right? So like we're talking about drastic differences. And it's like they're more active, they eat healthier, they have a social norms just around being more active and physically fit and things like that. And they don't allow a lot of these things that are kind of precursor to just kind of like being a little bit more lazy, like just scrolling through your phone all the time and eating really crappy food all the time. Even you go to mountain cities, like I live in Calgary, and right next to us is like Canmore, Banff, Kananaskis, and even in BC, there's just Rocky Mountains. You go to these towns, you're not going to see a lot of super overweight people there, because the people who flock there culturally all share, reasonably similar values. Maybe politically they're differing or whatever, but that's fine. But it's like they all love mountain biking and hiking and skiing and snowboarding. And there's not like tons of ultra processed foods out there as well. Like they have access to it, but it's just not really part of their thing. Yeah. And so I think those things are huge
all the time. Like it would be driving down a high street or something like that.
Yeah. And then like modeling behavior is another huge one. So if you have overweight parents, the probability that you're going to end up overweight or obese go up by 10 to 12 a multiple of 10 to 12, right? So it's like, if you model that behavior, that's another big thing, and like how many Mr. Olympia winners do you think hang out with like tons of really overweight people? It's like probably not very many. And it's not because I don't think they have anything against them. It's just like, because that's such a crazy part of your life, it just dominates everything. You're probably just going to be hanging around with other people who are in that world, And so that old saying where it's like you are the sum total of your 5 closest friends, I think there is a lot of truth to that. You tend to model the behavior of the people who you're around, right? And so it's like, if all of your friends are overweight, out of shape, unsuccessful at like getting a girlfriend or, with their business or whatever it is, it's like the probability that you're going to be the one rock star in the group is pretty low, and even if you are, you're certainly not going to get anything out of interacting with them, not to say that there should be like some sort of condition for friendship or whatever, but you kind of get my point.
So we all doomed to spiral obesity rates in that regard then, perhaps? I mean, if it's a positive, it's a positive feedback loop in a way due to those socio-cultural issues, then what can ultimately be the pivot point where you start reversing something that's already got so much positive momentum behind it, like a snowball effect,
I mean, that's a good question. Ultimately, I think that people just need to stop being stupid and stop pretending like things are way more complicated than they are. Like, you don't need optimal conditions to change. You just need sufficient conditions. Like, the reality is you don't need to do all of these things to have a successful business. Like, if you want to make 100,000 in your business, it's actually not that hard. Like, it seems really hard until you do it. And then you're like, oh, that's all I had to do, And then probably the same thing between getting to 100 to like 500,000 and 500,000 to 1 million, where you're like, oh man, like, how am I going to do this? And then you do it and you're like, oh, it's actually not that hard. It's like 1 or 2 things. And you just do that over and over and over and over again. And like just taking responsibility, like you don't need to wait for other people to change if you want to change. And I think that people just they can't tolerate that level of discomfort, and they can't tolerate like unfamiliarity. I think that's one of the big reasons why people will stay. And you look at people who are in abusive relationships, and they stay in abusive relationships, even though they know it's awful, but it's familiar, And so it's like, there has to be the desire to change. There has to be some sort of impetus. And then there has to be like a general level of skill sets to at least get you from here to right there. Maybe this isn't enough to actually get you the outcome, but at least it's one step in the right direction. Then you just keep taking those steps and eventually you get there. But like, from a social standpoint, I think we just have to stop being stupid. Stop being like, oh, you can be healthy at every size. Like, stop accepting low standards. Like, everyone just lowers the standards. Now, in some schools in Canada, you're not even allowed to fail students. And it's like, well, then what's the point of school if you can't fail them, And so I think just the massive lowering of expectations is wild, where people just don't care. And if no one expects anything from you, then why would you expect anything from yourself?
Well, I think a key word that you said there was desire, right? Because if people are trying to find their purpose, right?
Yeah.
So usually your purpose, will manifest when you're younger, things that you just really fell into or love to do, right? But if people are trying to figure out, well, what is my purpose? And that's where they start, but they don't have a desire to actually find what that purpose is, then they're going to scroll all the time. They're going to avoid actually having, in other words, there's a step before the step, right? So if they want to change physically, they have to have a desire to change physically before they actually go out to try to start anything, right? And that desire may last a long time, right? But they have to really want to do that, right? And find that reason to be able to do that. And outside of, I want to get stronger. Like, why? Like, why do you want to get stronger? Like, what? And then when they desire that, then the opportunities are abound.
Yeah.
Right. But if they just want it, then it's not that deep.
I think personal responsibility is like really, really lacking. It's not even personal responsibility, but like the desire to bear a burden.
Yes.
It's like, it's probably one of the most, I'll hear people say shit like, oh, I don't want to have a kid because like, I don't want to be limited in traveling. All I think, and this is just my opinion, so maybe I'm judgmental. All I think is how fucking selfish are you? 1, 2, you haven't even traveled in the last 3 years. So don't tell me it's because of travel. 3, you know that kids can travel too, right? Like you don't just lock them up in a cage in your house when you go to Mexico. Like, so it just like, but the lack of desire to take on a burden is really, I think, a major like philosophical and like spiritual existential problem that people have in like, at least in Canada, man. And, I, not to get super religious or anything like that, but there's, in the Bible, they talk about, Jesus gives a Sermon on the Mount, and he says like, if you do not hate your mother and your father and your wife, and even if you do not hate yourself, you cannot be my disciple. And what he's talking about is like your ability or your desire to bear your cross and sacrifice everything for this thing. And I think that there is so much purpose and fulfillment and meaning, like, it doesn't matter if someone's Christian or not, like in bearing responsibility for something and actually going out and really, it's like the action of carrying a burden is what makes you better. So if you're not willing to take on any sort of big burden or big task or big responsibility, then what are you doing? Because it doesn't feel good. Like, it doesn't feel good to freaking have a massive weight on your back and your freaking eyes explode. Like, but there's fulfillment in it. Like, you don't enjoy when you're doing a leg press and you feel like your quads are going to explode off your freaking knee. But then after the session, you're like, man, that was a good session. And you get something from it. And it's difficult to describe, but it's like, there was a very big obstacle and you overcame it. And now you're like, man, maybe I could do more. And all the people who are really willing to take on a huge burden generally accomplish some pretty cool things, And so I think that that's like an existential problem that some people have. And sure. I don't want to I got to kind of get off my pedestal. I'm not trying to like point fingers or anything like that, but that's something that I see for sure.
One of my favorite books for many reasons is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Yeah. Which is a good one. And at one point he quotes Spider-Man, which is, with great power comes great responsibility. But he says, really, it's the other way around. With great responsibility comes great power, meaning that the more things that you take responsibility for in your life, the more things you can control, the more fulfillment you can get. And he said, if only that had been flipped and people had remembered that quote, maybe people's mindsets would be a little bit different. And that's just kind of like trying to sum up what you were saying there a little bit.
That's such a great example. You should have just said that and told me to shut the fuck up.
No. Yeah. No, you said it very well. It's just that just really made it ring a bell in my head there. And it's just shirking away from responsibility just leads to lack of fulfillment.
Yeah.
And it leads you to outsource your happiness as opposed to get it from inside, for one of a better way of putting it.
And agency, like, what do you like if you just say that everything's out of my control, or if you just don't care about anything, then you have no agency over your own life. you know, and like, I don't know. I can't understand people.
Well, I think there's more things within your control than most people think there is.
Yeah.
You know, so it's, I used the example one time. It's my kid got in a lot of stupid car accidents, right? But
Sorry,
my son,
right.
And he's better now, but he had a problem for a long time and nothing was ever his fault. Right. I'm like, well, you decided to drive down that road.
Yeah.
Right. You could have drove down a different road. You could have went a different way. If you went that other way, then maybe you wouldn't have got a speeding ticket or got sideswiped, whatever it was. But it's still, even though somebody else hit you, right, which could be defined as not his fault, and insurance may define it as not his fault, you still made the choice to go out that night. Yeah. You know, so it's everything can be dialed back into full accountability if the person's willing to do that. Yeah. And I think they should, right? Because if they're willing to do that, yeah, the burden becomes everything then is your fault, right? Maybe that's the wrong word, you know, but if it's all my fault, then I have accountability to be able to change that, right? So I could take it as far as to say, I said it was okay for him to go out that night, so it's actually my fault.
Yeah.
You know, because I very well could have said, no, you know, you're not going to go out this night. So that's not going to happen. Yeah. And that would be my accountability to be able to dial back into. Everything can be pulled back into being your fault. Right. And that's kind of how I operate myself.
Yeah. I mean, stuff is going to happen to us regardless. Right. But like, you know, to use your example there, if he drove down the same street 3 times and got hit each time, none of them would be his fault. But he made the choice on the 3rd time to still drive down. You know, and it, you can apply that kind of logic and thought process to anything. Like, this may not be your fault, but you keep making the same choice that leads to the same end result happening to you.
Yes.
So why not try the other road?
Yes, and if you have a mindset where you're looking at things that way, you can find patterns. Yeah. Right. And then those patterns are like, oh, okay, now this is something I do have agency over. Now, if it's a one-off like that is, and there's 8 other one-offs and there's no pattern associated there, whatever, it's just life. Can't, you know, no real control there. But when patterns emerge, and you can't see patterns if you're not taking accountability, you know, you just can't. You know, and that thus becomes the problem, because no success is going to come without failure. Nobody's going to get stronger in the gym without adversity or overcoming adversity. It's just life. And I don't know where everybody got so
adverse to adversity.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, but I was trying to figure out a different way to say that. You know, adverse to adversity, or protected or sheltered, you know, or whatever that's going to be, because even if they are sheltered, if I sheltered my kids all through a certain point, there's going to be a time they're going to be out on their own, you know, in the real world. They're not sheltered. And are they prepared? Right? Because if they're not prepared, guess whose fault that is? It comes back again, right? So if that comes back and they're not prepared, well, then that's on me. If it's a client that you're working with and they're not prepared for their meet or check-in or whatever it's going to be, ultimately it falls back onto the coach, right? Now that coach could have just made a bad decision, shouldn't have taken this client. You know, it's not a good mix. It's not the client. You see, it all boils back. But for a lot of people, that's hard to conceptualize because that can make them think that they're just straight out of failure. And to me, it's just easier just to admit, yeah, I am. I'm always a failure, but there's some wins here and there. You know, that's a different way to look at it, where if you want to look at it to where everything is all wins and there's a failure here and there, good luck.
But that's, again, in that book, the subtle art of not giving a fuck, he says everyone should try that. He calls it something like extreme responsibility. Like, for 1 week, just every single thing that happens to you, you're responsible for it. You know, the guy cutting you up in the road or whatever it might be, just do it for 1 week and then just see how it starts to change your perception of, is life happening to you uncontrollably, or are you controlling your life and just kind of not seeing it? If that makes sense.
Yes.
It's wild too, because like you were saying, we have a lot more control over situations than we think. And the funny thing is, I think we can exert control over like a pretty small amount of variables when we look at like an expanded version. But even though we only have control over this, we can do so much. You know, it's like, you look at all the really, really rich and successful people, and they all say the same thing. about like how they got there and what happened. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, there's some pretty consistent and reliable behaviors that predict this. If you look like from economics example, right? In America right now, if you basically want to get out of poverty and be almost guaranteed, like there's like a 90-something% probability you're going to be guaranteed to be in the middle class. It's like, don't have a kid out of wedlock, be a high school graduate, and have a full-time employment. If you do that, you're almost guaranteed in the US, cross-culturally, across all variables, to be in the middle class. If you look at predictors of success when it comes to weight modulation, right? It's like people who lose a substantial amount of weight and successfully keep it off all have regular physical activity. They have some sort of dietary structure, regular weight monitoring, and social support, right? If you look at like pretty much any, like in business and anything, there's always going to be like a certain set of principles where it's like the application of those principles have a lot of variability, but those principles are like fundamental. And so when people talk about things as if it's like this deterministic, like, oh, well, it's out of my control. It's like, dude, no, you have so much control, even over the tiny amount of variables you can control. And like you were saying, even if you can't control something directly, you might be able to observe it early enough on so that you can avoid that, or you can have an indirect influence, which those two things can pay dividends, like especially in the long term, where you see an early indication of something, maybe like your blood pressure going up a little bit above normal. Maybe you don't think anything of it and you just let it go. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, my blood pressure is like 160 over like 100 now. And now it's a problem. But earlier on, you could have done something about it because you're like, hey, my blood pressure seems to be trending up, even though it's not in a problematic zone. Maybe I can do something about it now and at least intervene. Maybe it's not an issue, but maybe it is. And I can at least check off those boxes. So it's like, there's so much stuff that you can exert control over. And yeah, like you were saying, when you do, like in the guy of the book, whatever, the subtle art of not giving a fuck, the outcomes just speak for themselves, So it's pretty wild.
Well, there's distractions, I guess. It's because I've said this before, that if somebody is prioritizing things correctly, my definition correctly, and they take care of themselves first, mind, body, spirit, right? So they take care of that. So there's exercise, there's nutrition, there's time that's associated with that. And then their family. And then if they have a business, their business. There's not a whole lot of time after taking care of all those things and being responsible for all those things for me to really give a fuck about
anything else,
politics and all this other kind of stuff. Yeah. But what I see with a lot of people, friends of mine and associates and so forth, is they give a fuck about all that other stuff way more than those other three things, right? And it's like, if we can't control those things.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? We can have a voice and vote or whatever, but that's about where our real control stops. But when that takes away, and you can see it, and we all see it, when that takes away from those other things, you have control over yourself, right?
Yeah.
And you control over those other metrics as well, or somewhat control over those.
So you guys are going to love this. There's actually new data that's out looking at activism, because that's a big thing, because you just mentioned politically.
Yeah.
And what the research in aggregate shows is that people who are consistently involved in activism, primarily it's due to a lack of purpose in their life, and they display high degrees of narcissism and entitlement. And so when you look at all the people like you mentioned, it's like they don't have anything going on. So there's a purpose void. So they got to fill it with something. And if you don't have your own purpose, someone is going to force a purpose on you. And so it's like the people who generally get caught up in activism, narcissistic, super entitled, have a lack of purpose, and generally they are associated with lower levels of intelligence as well, and critical thinking ability. And so I just thought, like, when that paper came out, I was like, oh my God, this is freaking amazing. Because it just aligns so well with everything you kind of suspect anyways, based on just what you see. So I thought that was
the
hilarious.
Government just fudged all those results to say that about activists.
Yeah.
But you're right, like to go to Dave's kind of like trifecta there, like, fulfillment and happiness 99 times out of 100 is probably going to happen in like a microcosm. It's going to happen in your little small world that pretty much contains those three things and maybe a hobby and a job that you enjoy, right? It very rarely exists via social media or someone else's life or the great world around us.
I've never watched a reel and was like, oh my God, my life
Yeah,
just changed and have
like
goosebumps and I'm high-fiving people.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Like
not on
all
my
the-
Instagram that much.
like all the actual happy, fulfilling moments, pretty much happy within those 4 things, right?
Mhm.
And again, if you're right, if everyone just put more effort into those 4 things, you'd have a lot less fucks to give about all the other stuff.
Well, I mean, if it starts with yourself, I mean, I can't really be a great parent if I'm sick,
Mhm.
you know, if in any of those regards, you know, medically, physically, how good can I be for my own family? Right. So the prioritizing for a lot of people is upside down.
Mhm.
You know, it's macro issues first, and then the last thing they think about is themselves.
Yeah.
I'm like, but even if you had control over the macro issues, if you're not in shape and your brain doesn't function right, and you're constantly inflamed, and you know you're in brain fog, how much?
Sure.
I don't want you making policy.
Mhm.
You know, it's the fucking last person that I would want, right? I want somebody that can think clearly and know what the fuck that they're doing to be able to do that. And it's just inverse. It's upside down.
I mean, you can't give from an empty cup
No.
at the end of the day, right?
Yes, exactly. Did you have any other topics you had down there?
No, we pretty much skimmed over everything quite nicely, actually, that I'd written down on here, so I'm pretty happy.
Did you have any topics you wanted to discuss? I didn't bring up.
I don't think so. Not
The
necessarily.
only one that we didn't cover was, I saw that you posted about inverted commas fat math a few times recently. But, which was one that I kind of liked. I liked the terminology and the idea behind that.
yeah.
So if you want to go into that, that was a funny one, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't really scroll through social media much. Like I open it up so I can respond to my DMs and engage with the comments and make a post, and that's about it. If while I'm doing that, I see someone's post that I know, I'll always try and like, share, and whatever, just because like I want to support their business and stuff. But people would send me like reels of things where it's like girl math is this, boy math is this, and then it's what's an example of this? It's like
I think it's based around the idea that to be a good coach, you have to be a pretty high level athlete or something like that. So.
Yeah, but I mean it. So my comment was based off of like a meme that's been circulating, or like a theme for memes where it's like boy math is taking a girl to dinner and thinking that means you can sleep with her. Like I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it's something like that, right? And so I just wrote something like, fat math is thinking that you can be like morbidly obese but get someone in great shape or something like that. But again, it just boils down to like, you know, what's your outcome? Like if you can produce this outcome for other people, then you should be able to do it for yourself. And people always point to Shiko and they're like, well, what about Boris Shiko? It's like, well, Boris Shiko was on the national team as a powerlifter. And he also had an extremely rare and unique circumstance in that he is his master's, or he's a master of sport, but then he also had the Russian weightlifting team, the powerlifting team to coach. And he was around all of the top level coaches. So it's like, I don't know why people point to that. It's like, show me all the top level athletes and then look at their coaches. Their coaches are almost always really top level guys, you know? And it's like, is it 100% ubiquitous across the board? No, but people tend to like, it's like saying, okay, this parachute is going to open up 10% of the time. How confident are you to jump out of this airplane? And everyone's like, well, I'm not going to jump out of it. And it's like, of course, but you're totally fine telling other people that they should just pay for your services, you know, but it's the exact same premise. It's like, you wouldn't even follow your own advice, yet you're expecting other people to pay for your services, you know? And, you know, when I always talk about results, I'm always talking about relative to baseline.
Yes.
So strength relative to baseline. So you look at someone like, what is his name? Steve Hall, or like Eric Helms, guys like that, they're natural bodybuilders. They're not massive guys, but you look at where they started and you look at where they are now, and it's like, okay, that's a drastic difference. So they've displayed a substantial amount of ability to execute and education, stuff like that, by how much they change relative to their baseline. And then same thing with strength, and same thing with, you know, whatever else it is that you're looking towards. And so that's a demonstration in addition to what athletes have they produced and things like that. But,
I think you made a really important distinction there, though. It's relative to baseline.
Yeah.
In that it's not necessarily the number one lifter, but how far said lifter has come from their baseline. That quite often determines how much they've had to learn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because even me, like, I'm not the strongest guy, you know, like, but when I first started lifting weights, I was a boxer, you know, so I was like 6 foot. When I was a kid, I was 6 foot and like 165 pounds. That was my walking weight, right? Now I'm 100 pounds heavier than that, right? So it's like, okay, there's some sort of ability to put on muscle, right? Am I the biggest guy? No. That chick the other day was way more jacked than me, man. I'm looking at her physique and I'm like, man, that's like my physique, Cole. That's crazy. She's got such a freaking crazy physique. She's such an impressive athlete. And all the other guys, same thing. They're like twice my size, right? And so I don't think you need to be the biggest guy. I don't think you need to be the strongest guy, but like you need to demonstrate ability in some respect. Like no one would go to someone who's broke and be like, hey, can you give me financial advice or help me market my business? It just doesn't make any sense. But somehow in this realm, there's like this, it's different somehow. And I don't understand it because no one would apply that to their own life. Like if you actually get them to abide by their standard, they just don't. And so many people these days are like, they get away with just speaking nonsense and advocating for policies or ideologies or things that they don't follow themselves. And it's absurd and no one calls them out for it. And I think that's preposterous. So I don't know.
Sure. No, I get it. There's a Yogi Bear quote, and I think I'm going to probably butcher it.
Did you say Yogi Bear?
Yogi Bear, yeah. Which
like
is
the cartoon?
Yes. It's very profound though. It's that
Superman and Yogi Bear, man. This is good.
It's that in theory and practice are the same thing, but in practice they're very different.
That
is a yoke. I might have butchered it, but that is from yoke. So what I'm saying is if you're a coach who hasn't put some time in under the bar or whatever the endeavor might be, how do you, because nothing ever comes out of a scientific research paper being like, here's the ultimate program for everyone, or here's a defining principle that everyone must, it's never, right? So how do you, there is sometimes a cosmic chasm between theory and application, unless you're in the middle doing some of it to find out how you get from one to the other. How do you know how to apply it then? Even if you're the most intelligent, well-versed, strength coach or researcher or whatever, you never just take the research study and apply that to your client, right? There's the individualization process, the periodization, whatever. So, you have to be in the trenches to some degree to understand what it's like to take those theories and apply them in the gym. Like the one we were talking about the other day about 50 sets is better for muscle growth. You're like, sure, have you ever done a 50 set leg workout?
Yeah.
Good luck. Do you know what I mean? Or like how you're going to do that once and then not train them for 3 months afterwards or whatever. Do you know? And if you don't train yourself, at least to some degree, you have no idea how to interpret those things, right?
Well, the funny thing is, like, you literally don't have to go past your own lived experience. It's like, how do you learn things? How do you learn what kind of person you're into, like as a partner, potential mate? It's like, well, you go on a couple dates and you're like, I don't really like this person. Why don't I like this person? Well, they had X, Y, and Z characteristics, and here's why. And then you date a couple people and you figure out what you're into and what you're not into, and compatibility and all of that other stuff, and whether or not you share values. And it's like everything comes through lived experience. All of our, that's literally how science actually was started. Was we were trying to find a way to explain the natural laws of the world. Right. So it comes out of observation. And so observation only happens through personal experience. So it's like, people become so disconnected sometimes that I'm like, okay, whatever. Like if you don't want to trust that, then that's fine. But I don't know. I will. And
then even just from a coaching perspective, you've got someone dieting down for a bodybuilding show. If you've never dieted to almost any degree, maybe you've never been stage lean or whatever, but if you've never dieted to any degree,
what are you talking about, bro? Like 4% body fat right now.
How do you know what that client's really going through when they're giving you their check-in? What is the acceptable level of suffering at 2 weeks out, or whatever the terminology you want to use? You can at least show some empathy and be a better coach for it, if nothing else. At least that's what I would think anyway.
Well, even things that so there's a big difference between dieting down to, let's say, 10%, where you're pretty lean, but dieting down to 6 or 7%. Like there's a very, very big difference. And that last couple percent can make a massive difference. It can cause serious GI distress. It can cause serious psychological distress. Your sleep can be totally fucked. Like there's so many things. And you're like, well, I've gotten really lean before. It's like, yeah, but that last bit is so different. And if you haven't experienced that, or if you haven't taken other people through it, you've got no way of knowing. And so if something comes up, you don't know that there's a causal link there, and so it's really difficult to make that to make that link on your own.
Well, that last bit is and what you're speaking about, getting super lean or peaking for a strength event.
Yeah.
That last bit is the hardest bit.
Yeah.
You know, when I dieted down with all Justin, Shelby, all those guys, I was very clear. Like, I'm willing to go down as far as what you would call contest prep, but not the last 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Right? That I'm not competing.
Yeah,
That's it. I don't want to deal with that. And it's still hard, even the last 10 weeks, you know, it's still hard. But that takes somebody that's been there, because now you got to calculate, you got to know there's brain fog, there's all kinds of shit. And when a refeed would happen or not happen, you know, there's a lot of nuance that happens even with, you know, peaking for a strength event. The last couple of heavy weeks, you're fucked up. You know, you're beat up. And as a coach, you would know that if you've done it. Like, yeah, this is supposed to kind of feel like shit right now. That's why we taper off. If you've never known that, then they start complaining. And if they're a good coach and somebody's complaining about pain and all this other shit, you're going to pull them back. Not if you've been through that and this is a peaking endeavor. That's a whole nother fucking conversation. That's a whole other skill set.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you can realize that skill set without doing it.
Yeah. And actually, so I'm going to quote Alex Hormozi again, because I've been reading his books. I really like his stuff. But he was saying, and like, I totally agree with this. It's like, what gets your business from, like, you know, 0 to 100,000 is not necessarily the same thing that's going to get it to 1 million. And that's not necessarily the same thing that's going to get it to 10 million or 100 million or 1 billion. It's like all those different stages may require completely different things or skill sets. And it's the same thing that you're saying, because like that last 4 weeks, it's like you might look at it in terms of a timeline or body fat percentage. And you're like, well, I lost 20% body fat. I only have 3% more to lose. Like, how much of a difference? And it's like that difference is everything. You know, 3%, like a 3% difference in a sprinter is like you're like 100th versus first. You know, like it's wild, and so it can be such a big difference. And yeah, I mean, you look at all the best coaches, and they're always the most experienced ones. And I don't think that that's like I don't understand how anyone could justify that and say, oh, that's just a coincidence. It's like, would you trust a heart surgery on someone who just came out of medical school, or like who's just now allowed to perform heart surgery? Like, their first heart surgery is on you. It's like, how confident would you feel? I'd be like, no, I want the dude who's been doing this for like 50 years, you know? And I don't know. I think that's the thing. I think when people have something to lose and they actually have something on the line, that's when you find out what their actual values are.
Well, it's interesting that you say that the heart surgery, because if somebody tears a bicep or somebody tears a pec, right? One of the first things they want to know is, how many surgeries has this guy done? Like, nobody's going to be like, yeah, I want to go to, you've never done a pec tear surgery before. I want you. Yeah. It's like, no, this dude's done like 300. I mean, every athlete will tell you that if they get hurt, majorly hurt, they're going to try, if they're smart, they're going to try to find the best qualified person that they can. Outside topic, what I strongly advise everybody to do is look for those orthopedics before the problem happens. So you don't have to take the one that is just going to pick you up in the ER, because you go in there, because the ER guy may not necessarily be the best person to actually do that. So it's, you know, have a clue first. That way, if you blow your quad or tear something off,
you've got one speed.
It's like, okay, you know, here I go. And no, you're not doing it. I'd like Dr. X, Y, and Z or whatever to be able to go that. But it becomes nuanced with what you're saying, though, because if we're going to use the example of physicians, and then that argument would come back and say, well, my physician's not healthy. You know, my physician's in terrible fucking shape. You know, so why go to a physician that's not in good shape? And there's nuance there. And now you got to look at the system and the model and how it operates, where a physician's job is to treat, not to prevent, right? That's just how the system is orchestrated and has always been. So the physician's going to prescribe based upon that last 30 people he saw over the past week that had the same symptoms. It's like, oh, this is the same thing here, boom, in and out, kind of go there. So we can argue about the system being broken, right? But the system isn't prevention. Right now, if you're to go to a physician for prevention, well, then it's probably not the physician that you're currently already seeing,
Yeah.
right? Because that's a different model.
Yeah.
That physician may have an hour-long appointment, or it may be like Merrick Health, something along those lines, to where now their objective is no medications, get you healthy, accountability, physical fitness, and all that. I just throw that out there because I've seen those conversations about, should a coach lift or whatever, and it's Boris Chico always comes out. So, and then, well, your doctor, that gets thrown in there too.
Sure.
Your doctor could be a chain smoker. That doesn't change the fact that he's going off the last 100 patients that he saw that had the same symptoms, and this is the thing that he has, and he's not in the prevention business. He's in the treatment business because that's how they're trained.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, medicine is like really, really good for major acute issues. It's like, you got a car accident, you got this. Okay, we need to do this. We can do surgery. Like, they're really, really dialed in with that stuff for the most part. But yeah, there's not really any major thing around like prevention. And I mean, it's so obvious because you look at like health guidelines, you look at all the stuff, and they're nonsense. They've got Lucky Charms that have a health check box.
Oh yeah.
Where it's like, oh, this is heart friendly and whatever. And it's like, it's a designation that's approved by the government. And you're like, come on guys, like what the hell's going on here? And so like, yeah, exactly. Like you said, it's like, you can look at that, but that's not what it's meant for. It should probably be, but it's not what it's meant for. And let's say you do see a physician who's not in great shape. Let's say you happen to find someone who is in phenomenal shape, who was an athlete, who actually lives that lifestyle. You think that their treatment modalities are not going to be drastically different?
Oh, of course.
Like both of these guys might get you on, medication to reduce your blood pressure, but only this guy is going to be like, hey, we need to come up with some sort of exercise and dietary intervention to make sure that we can actually address that, and then hopefully taper back your blood pressure medicine every now and then and see where you're at on your own, and blah, blah, blah. And so it's like completely different approaches. But again, one is driven by the fact that he is a healthy guy. He knows what he's doing, and that's kind of part of his own value structure. But yeah, like you're saying, that's not necessarily part of the intrinsic healthcare model, unfortunately. But luckily, yeah, there is Merrick Health. There's a lot of other places that are popping up because I think the need for that stuff is really becoming a lot more recognized. And so we do have a lot of really great resources, which is cool.
Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and wrap this up, and we're going to do a crew cast after this. So for you guys that are listening, the crew cast, we're going to get into some topics that are going to be a little controversial and fun to talk about.
Okay.
So so thank you for coming. How can people follow you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on again, man. It was awesome to come here and not be super skinny boy anymore. I feel like I've kind of somewhat redeemed myself. But yeah, so Instagram and YouTube, Daniel_DeBrocke. That's where most people can find me. I think I'm going to be on more platforms, but that's like, we're slowly building out the content side of things, the team that I have or whatever. But for right now, it's mostly just Instagram and YouTube. That's where all the content is. And then that'll be the best way to reach me. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for coming out, Tom. Thanks for helping. We're going to shut this down, take a break, come back, and talk about some other stuff. Hey guys, real quick, we realized that something ridiculous, like 80% of the people that watch the podcast don't subscribe. So subscribe to the channel, and make sure to check out the description for more details on the guest, links to their pages, and give us a few days, but the show notes will be there. Or not the show notes, the timestamps. Hey, we're just rolling with this thing right now. If you're serious about your training goals, you know what you put in your body matters. We also know the supplement industry is a complete mess. This is why we've partnered with First Attachment, and they are the sponsor of today's episode. Whether you want to lose fat, build muscle and strength, or just boost your overall health, First Attachment has something for you, ranging from pre and intra-workout, fat burner, kidney and liver support, and nighttime recovery, all designed with performance in mind. If you care about what goes into your supplements, and you should, you'll be glad that First Attachment prioritizes clean, effective ingredients without any unnecessary fillers or artificial additives. Plus, I have known one of the owners for over 2 decades, and Justin Harris is not one to cut corners, and someone I've always trusted with advice on training, nutrition, and supplements. Head over to firstattachment.com and check out their full lineup. As a special offer for Table Talk listeners, use the code TABLETALK at checkout for a 10% discount on your first order. All right, guys, thanks for watching the video to the end. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and click here, 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 or here for more videos.